be here. I love you all.
Hello and welcome to the Scannain podcast, your weekly look at the world of film news, Irish International. I'm Darren Mooney, and joining me are...
Luke.
Jay.
Ronan.
And Grace.
And this week we've got a very special episode for you. Because it's our last episode of the year so far, we're taking next week off. We're going to be talking...
Sorry.
Finally give us a holiday.
Love you guys so much. But we're going to talk about the year that it has been in film. So we're going to skew the usual format. We're not going to talk about the top 10. We're not going to talk about new releases, which this week is just Mary Poppins. And we're not going to talk about film news. We're just going to talk about how the year has been for each of us. So we're going to talk a little bit about it generally. Then we're going to go through the top 10 films at the Irish box office this year, which I'm sure there's a lot of excitement for. Then we're going to go through each of our contributors' top 10s as well, which is probably where the real meat of the podcast
I'm
will
actually really excited. This is
Where
my
the real
podcast.
disagreement is going to come in.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not Christmas without a family argument.
It's going to get loud.
I think it's going to be lovely and polite because we all learned our lesson from La La Land, remember?
That was a different podcast, I think, wasn't it?
Nevertheless,
it's cross many podcasts.
Okay.
It's in the wider universe. The thing is, I think we're going to agree more the closer we get to one. So, again, like Christmas, everybody gets a bit of drink in them.
Yeah.
We're building towards that angel atop the Christmas tree is what we're saying here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the year that it has been in terms of film. How was 2018 for everybody?
Long.
Very long. But in film.
In film year, I think it's actually, like we've discussed before, Darren, there's no real bad years in film ever.
That's it. Like every year you get that, like people complaining about
it's
it.
how dig you deep and how much work you want to put in, how many bad films you want to avoid, as generally myself and Grace will have a tendency to do. Luke and Darren probably go headfirst into the breach of...
You brave soldiers.
Yeah, and do it all for all of us, which is great. But if you dig a little deeper, if you want to go as far as you want to go, there are a lot of stuff, as there always is every year. There's no bad years, just bad effort.
Yep. If you look at the average score I gave out this year, it was probably pretty high, but I'm sure there's lots of crap I missed and lots of great things I missed. It's the same every year. I don't think you can objectively say, 2017 or 2018 was better. I kind of think it's a nonsense. But I saw a lot of films I really liked this year.
Same.
Yeah. It's been a sort of a wonderfully broad year as well. It's probably been a very good year for Netflix as well. This is the year that we've seen Netflix, and it's great because when
I was literally about to say that. It's been an amazing year for Netflix movies, which means I don't even have to leave the house. It's awesome.
Grace, you've finally your dream of being a shut-in is now complete.
And that's convenient because
All I need is
2018
my
was a
farm.
great year to not leave the house.
Yeah. As Snowmageddon illustrated.
and probably a better use of your internet connection as well.
Yeah.
But the thing about Netflix is that, because we talk about the podcast every week, we do new releases, what's coming out. And increasingly as we got towards the end of the year, every week has had a major Netflix release of some description, which is...
And their award slate's pretty strong, wasn't it? I mean,
like Roma, is going to be a Best Picture nominee, despite the fact it's in black and white. It's in a foreign language, and it's released primarily on streaming.
Cuarón, though, is a strong director and has previous...
Yeah. There's no surprise to see it likely to get a Best Picture nomination, but there is a bit of surprise that nobody else wanted to touch it, really. And Netflix sort of leaped into the breach to say, yep, we'll do that.
That's probably a good sort of leapfrog into something else that happened this year. And this is something that people have noticed, particularly, say, Scott Mendelsohn at Forbes, which is the argument that what we've seen increasingly in the autumn slate is we've seen a move away from the idea of, prestige awards fair, in that we had a number of films outside of blockbuster season, and blockbuster season keeps growing and growing and growing, but we had a number of releases outside that sort of floundered and failed. So, for example, I'm thinking of Widows, I'm thinking of First Man, I'm thinking of even Bad Times at the El Royale. Now, Bad Times at the El Royale was divisive among critics, but First Man was very well received, 92% positive, 80-something on Metacritic. It was being hailed coming out of Venice. You had Widows, which is still widely loved. It hasn't experienced the backlash of a similar manner. Thank you, Jay.
Sorry.
But we've had this sort of argument emerging that, you have, and we'll be talking about the top 10 films of the Irish box office, and some of them are going to be Oscar contenders. But we've had an argument that the current movie climate is sort of squeezing those mid-budget, adult-aimed films out of the market and towards Netflix, to the point where you're getting, The Irishman on Netflix.
I'm not necessarily going to agree with that, because I think in every Oscar season there are casualties. There are films that pre-Venice and pre-Toronto are lauded as potential Oscar winners, and we've seen them disappear before. Films that come out and go, and then bye-bye.
Right.
I mean, I just off the top of my head, I remember The Founder being one of the Oscar kind of talk-ups pre that release, and kind of floundered. If you
But,
want to
it, but
admit
it,
that.
it didn't have quite the same appeal coming out of the festival. So
No, my point is there's always casualties.
Oh, yeah.
Even I know you were saying
I know,
that,
but the casualty
that go
this
beyond
time
that.
seems to be the opening weekend rather than the critical response to
Yeah,
it.
but I mean, the critic, yeah, but that's two different things to some degree. I mean, the prestige film is still there and will
Yeah.
limp on forever because Oscars needs their prestige film. Some will go to Netflix. I think that's the kind of the kind of sideways shift, definitely, and I can absolutely see that. But
The thing about Oscar races, though, is that's such an inside baseball thing within studios. The studios can drop a film that's not looking like a contender very quickly.
I do,
and do, and they go with what looks like it's gonna pick awards, not what is looking like the strongest film. And at the first hint of weakness, like say with First Man, they're not going to push that.
Yeah.
They're not going to send that out to as many people for consideration and such. I think with Netflix and with Amazon as well, again, you're seeing they've got the pockets to really cover the spread in terms of prestige pictures.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's just a little statue, but they're probably individuals within those organizations that want that really badly.
I think it's really important.
This happened in the 90s with DreamWorks in a big way.
Yeah.
They were going after the biggest and most high-profile prestige pictures because individuals within DreamWorks really wanted that for that studio, for what it would bring to that studio and to the individuals in it. I think that's probably the same for Netflix.
I think Netflix and Amazon strive for legitimacy in terms of
well, because they already have commercial success based on the user base.
They want
and the
the
money.
prestige kind of.
They want the
nod.
legitimacy of it.
Yeah, they do. They absolutely do. Like,
they want
you see that
streaming
from festivals as well, saying like Cannes not having Netflix films and so on.
And Venice saying, "Come here, give us those."
For the marketing clout, it would give them to have that level of legitimacy, and also to attract more talent. I think,
Which is
it's more important
the
than
pockets
getting into the establishment of the work.
Exactly.
So.
And I mean, and it's led to some interesting results. I mean, we point to Roma. Roma is probably the contender that will go the distance. It's probably
it's looking like it.
The first sort of streaming. And I mean, they admittedly they conceded a little bit by pre-screening in cinemas a week before it was released in the States in certain markets. But I mean, even beyond that, you have like a Coen Brothers film on Netflix that you can watch instantly. You have Outlaw King isn't going to win any awards, but from the outset, it's from the director of Hell or High Water.
Even Private Life got it kind of. It got in the awards conversation. It doesn't seem to be kind of gaining any traction, but it's certainly in lists of films that should be in the mix. It's kind of popped up.
Maybe even in some list later today.
I might be mentioning it at some point.
And Annihilation as well.
Well, that was international,
And the way that Netflix functions, you can see that's one aspect of its appeal to filmmakers that maybe doesn't get considered so much, is that if you're working in a studio and you're going for a prestige picture and then it doesn't pick up traction, that's a big hit for you and how you're kind of perceived by audiences. Whereas, for example,
even within the organization,
with Buster Scruggs, it's not gonna get Oscar nominations or anything, but that's not gonna affect the Coens in any way.
Yeah.
Not that it would with them specifically, with other
because they
studios,
built up that momentum and that trust. Yeah.
But because of Netflix's kind of close guardedness over their viewing figures and such, you don't get that big hit with these films if they don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
I think Netflix are developing relationships as well in that regard, so they don't really mind it. The next one will, they'll develop a relationship where the second or third film might.
Yeah. Also, it means they have a library. Like Netflix are building a library because they realize that other distributors are going to develop their own online distribution network. So you're going to have like a Paramount one, you're going to have a Warner Brothers one. Yeah. You're going to have these platforms, and Netflix realized that all the content that they were very lucky to have in the early 2000s.
They paid very little for it.
They paid very little because nobody figured it was worth anything. And now you have CBS going, well, we'll take all the Star Trek off Netflix, put it on our own service, and see if we can make money that way.
And next year is where you see the blood start to really flow on that, because a lot of these services are launching in the next couple of months.
Disney's the one that's going to make people quake.
Yeah, and also, you might as well get all this in while you have an administration that doesn't care about the United States versus Paramount very much.
That is also a case.
And the lines that might be blurred therein with all these streaming platforms.
I will be intrigued to see how other streaming platforms approach new talent, because Netflix has been an incredible boon for a lot of female and minority filmmakers, and there's an incredible archive even, and just so many films on there that you wouldn't even realize were directed by women, because obviously you've heard nothing about them, and then you go on and you scroll through there and there's so much availability and opportunity there, and I'd be really interested to see if other distributors or studios get their own streaming services up and rolling, is this something they'll be as friendly towards or open to?
I'd
Given
agree.
that these are
I'd
more
absolutely
kind
agree.
of archetypal, old-fashioned establishment figures that maybe have not always been very well.
You see it, but like say CBS launched their own thing, and it's like CBS is well known issues
Behind the scenes,
behind the
last
scenes
minute,
that you wonder whether they'll ever get the house in order, because even the TV one or two of the TV shows that launched this year apparently have storylines.
Well, this is Bull.
Bull was the one that
where you had the issue behind the scenes with Alicia Dushku, who's had
And,
a very sad history with that sort of
and
stuff.
there's the show, apparently I haven't seen Bull, but apparently some of the storylines in it were very kind of
Well, CBS is an old-fashioned
ishy,
conservative,
very
yes.
iffy in terms of women and stuff like that. That it's being kind of put through as a kind of company policy almost. So,
But
Well, I mean, that said, you do have stuff like, say, The Good Fight, which is on the
True.
CBS service, which is...
no, I know, but they're doing it for money. They're
Yeah,
not,
I know, we've
but-
talked about
They're
this.
made the
We've talked,
exception
yeah.
as opposed to the
Yeah, exactly.
But on Grace's point about Netflix there, like if you're the kind of person that seeks out more, female directed films or minority directed films, for example, then you can do that. But Netflix has the potential to make that a lot more accessible to people that aren't inclined to do it. Yeah. Because if you watch Cam, for example,
Yes.
then Netflix is going to suggest to you
Similar
more films
to-
that are directed by women or films of that nature.
Yeah.
And it kind of opens doors for
It
people
does.
that they don't even realize
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
going through. Or it can.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this. Where like Veronique, which is a Spanish language horror film, became a viral online sensation simply through Netflix. That would never have gained any traction in cinema over here. That nobody would have. Very few people who enjoyed it. Like my younger sister, who is not necessarily a fan of world cinema as a concept, would never have gone to the cinema to watch a Spanish language exorcism thriller. But because somebody had seen it on Netflix and recommended it to her, and because it was right there, it's the click of a button. It's incredible. It's a huge, democratic sort of force for movie making and for movie consuming.
And it's funny to me looking back in the past year how it sort of replaced what television used to do when I was younger, because as I have previously mentioned, I have a relic of television. So Netflix now shows me loads of films that I just instantly love and loads of tripe that I nevertheless look on fondly, because I'm like, you had a chance and you got out there. You didn't deserve it in the end, but nevertheless I enjoyed your 70 minutes of rubbish.
I admire your
Starring
equal
a
opportunities
high-profile
commitment.
actor or actress who really should have known better.
Is there anything else in terms of 2018 in the year that has been in terms of film? Anything that sort of jumped out at us? I mean, the best popular film at the Oscars, which is probably going to be just Best Picture this year.
That's dead, right? I mean, we're not going to see that again.
It's down pending consideration by the
which usually
Academy.
means somebody's killed it.
Yes, it's been killed without admitting that it's killed.
See, was it Christopher McQuarrie today coming out on Twitter to say just do a best stunts category, which
That's a long
is
overdue.
Yeah,
and
and
best
casting.
Absolutely staggering
Yeah.
to me.
It really is the worst part of it is that stunts probably isn't the biggest thing anymore. Whereas there's probably 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of people that should have been recognized.
Nice, but weren't.
Maybe
Yeah.
we could finally give Tom Cruise an Oscar for risking his life for us in every Mission Impossible movie. We're
Break
so
that ankle for the
ungrateful.
Oscar, Tom.
Yeah,
Go on. If DeCaps could ride a fake horse off a fake cliff,
And-
do you think we
yeah.
could give Tom Cruise
I
something
think
for
that's fair.
dangling from the
I'd
Burj
agree.
Khalifa?
I totally agree.
Well, that's it. Yeah, we've had this. I've had this discussion online where people make a very convincing argument that we celebrate Daniel Day-Lewis for the commitment that he shows to his
I
role.
don't celebrate
But
Daniel Day-Lewis.
did he ever break his ankle while filming a scene and limp through it because
Yeah.
he's just that
In
much?
fairness,
but he
though,
made
suffered through
shoes in
breakfast.
Italy.
He was rude to the rest of the cast.
They suffer through confrontations at breakfast.
Yeah, breakfast
How
is
much
like,
more-
it's a battleground.
Expect somebody to suffer, yeah.
That's the noise of toast being buttered. I feel his pain.
Really excruciating.
Yeah.
And
Depends on
then,
the type of bread, though, surely.
Yeah. I don't think Daniel is gonna truck into the semantics of it. No, I don't think it's his bit.
Sorry, I'm very strongly interested in toast. I won't take this abuse.
and there he just finally, actually, something that probably is of more interest to me than to anybody else at this table, the interesting shift towards China that we started seeing in terms of
Darren,
blockbuster
your
production. This is my little conspiracy
subgenre
theory
of weirdness.
tinfoil hat,
Yeah.
where we're starting seeing major movie production being pushed over into China. Now, we've seen it for years. We've seen stuff like, say, the Transformers films, where the fourth one, I believe, goes to Hong Kong, and pauses to remark on how wonderful the Hong Kong local government is, as compared to the corrupt and decadent Americans. You have Iron Iron Man 3, which has an entire subplot from the Chinese version, where a Chinese doctor, who is barely glimpsed in the version that we've seen, helps Tony Stark literally heal his heart and teaches him that he needs to reject his decadent Western ways.
Version?
Oh, you didn't hear this?
The Chinese version.
I'm busy doing other things. I don't have time for alternate versions. I brings you to things.
Like, this is the thing, like, Once Upon a Deadpool is the movie I most regret not catching
I know you do,
this
Darren.
year. And that part of that is because, like, a lot of conspiracy theories about why it exists, it doesn't exist because Disney's road
It's to make
testing
money in
PG-13.
China.
Yeah, it's to make money in China.
Yeah,
it's to release a version of Deadpool that can be released over there.
Yeah.
Because Aquaman has already earned enough money in China that it can produce a sequel. Like, despite the fact
help
that...
us all. Have
despite
you not watched Entourage, people?
It earned less than Black 47 at the Irish box office this weekend to give a sense of scale to that. But yeah, and even stuff like movie production moving over there. So, for example, the sequel to, what was it called? Escape Plan. Where Sly Stallone and Dave Bautista...
Noted high-profile escape plan.
Two, thank you very much. But yeah, Schwarzenegger's not back. But stuff like, for example, like a plot that hinges on a developer of a Chinese smartphone who is illegally arrested by Americans who try and, yep, there we go, we're getting topical, who tries to force him in order to, like, give up the vital information and to give them a backdoor into their communications network.
Yeah,
but he can't. Because there is no backdoor, you decadent American capitalist.
I'm fine with American kind of covert stuff being found out and called out. Like, I mean, you know.
This does seem to me like the logical
fair.
result of Hollywood's endless race to the bottom and absolutely reckless need to make as much money as they possibly can, in keeping with, you know, every other government and private venture.
The market has now changed, so they're going to adapt to fit it. And it's amazing. They've been doing this for years. You know, Richard Gere films are not shown in China because he criticized Taiwan from the stage of the Academy Awards. China has dictated policy in Hollywood for some time, but it's really spilling into the mainstream now.
I mean, you remember Cruise in The Last Samurai, Matt Damon in The Great Wall.
Yeah.
Like, they'll go over and do the prestige big picture as well, like, you know, to
get the market open, which is, and I mean,
Samurai is Japanese, though.
yeah, but it's the Asian market, quote unquote.
China,
You know.
Japan, though.
and
Oh no, that's a different.
Rough history.
Yeah, let's not get into that.
But it's absolutely fascinating because it kind of demonstrates like the shifting of global power. Because like in the 80s you were doing this sort of thing, but you were doing Iron Eagle, you were doing Delta Force.
Oh, I remember that. Red Dawn.
Yeah, Red Dawn and stuff like that.
Yeah,
now you're doing
Rocky
movies
IV.
like China Salesman, in which Steven Seagal and Mike Tyson go to Africa to shill for, again, a Chinese telecommunications company that desperately want to build infrastructure and prevent genocide, if only those slimy Western capitalists wouldn't get in their way.
Can I say, we have talked about China salesmen proportionally far too much on this podcast. But I take the point, though.
All right.
Just to say.
So that's basically the film, unless there's the year in film, unless there's anything else.
We should probably mention the Irish year in film. It's been a very good one.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Niall did a list up and it's like there's been 40-ish releases.
40 releases in
which
cinemas,
is kind of absurdly
a number of
big.
them extremely high profile and making quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
A lot more than international films did at the Irish box office, which is really, really
Again,
good to see.
Black 47 trumping a lot of international releases. It beats Solo, I believe. It also beat Aquaman so far.
Also, you see something like The Favourite, which is Element produced, is up to 6.7 million in the US at the moment, and climbing and expanding.
And incredibly
week on week.
high per screen as well, which is a very strong indicator.
But it's increasing like in the hundreds of percent each week, on the way to inevitable Oscar nominations. So these things happen.
And we talked a little bit about like the Netflix films, them getting to a stage where it's releasing one major Netflix film a week. And we had a stage in the summer where we were bouncing from major Irish release to major Irish release, where we're going Black 47 to Rosie to Michael Inside.
Yeah, it's been a solid year. I've a few Irish films in the mix for me. Like there's 6 or 7 films within, maybe even 8 films, Irish films in my top 20, 30 of the year.
Yep.
That's remarkable.
Which is amazing. It's a great year and a great sign of where the industry is.
It's not just us looking within our bubble. Like, the success, for example, of The Favourite, or the way that the relationship between A24 and Element Pictures, these are indicators that Ireland is perceived in a certain light by these studios and these distributors. In the way that, say, South Korea would be seen as
we've made a
hub of reliable.
Like,
exactly.
There's
a not a brand, but a reputation there internationally.
And it seems to get stronger year on year. And the release schedule over a year seems to be more confident than it would have been in previous years. We're throwing it out there. and they're
not
getting
afraid to
audience, not
go
always
head
kind
to
of
head
biggest
with
ones.
bigger
big
films,
American
quote unquote.
releases. Yeah.
And I think particularly good, as every one of the last couple of years, particularly good year for Irish documentary.
We're very
it's
good
just
at
typical
Irish,
year on year. There are great Irish
Remarkably
documentaries
though,
out
and
there.
this, I don't know why this is, and I think it's worth probably mentioning, our documentaries rarely, if ever, get into the mix for documentary Oscars, which considering, and I generally see a lot of the Oscar documentaries, though this year is a little slower. The Irish documentaries generally trumpet most of the years in terms of quality.
Yeah.
I'm surprised. I don't know why that is. I don't know how
I
they're
have a
pitched.
feeling a lot of our documentaries focus on stuff that's very culturally significant to us and mightn't make as much of an impact abroad if people don't appreciate
But
the context.
I think that's a fair point to some degree. But some of the documentaries that do kind of get into the mix, there's arguments
but
that they
it's
do
an
somewhat
awareness
similar.
thing, you know, like
Yeah,
which arguably these documentaries should help to further. But I
Yeah.
also think sometimes that people may look at something, like say about the Troubles, for example, and not really understand why it might be momentous versus the.
Oh yeah, I know,
documentaries
I
that
completely
make
agree.
about
But I think
Troubles.
we've done all sorts of documentaries in the last few years that I thought might have got, and the subjects might have been more diverse.
Well, I do remember there being some discussion. I can't remember about which Irish documentary it was in particular, but we had this discussion about the question of where a documentary's aimed. Because if it's a documentary that's aimed at a wider market in terms of explaining the Troubles, watching it with an Irish audience, it always feels very basic because you have to.
We've kind of come to accept that
Yeah.
to some degree. It's like the trouble started, and yada. We you know, it's annoying, but you get over it. Like.
I just like the idea of somebody at the Academy looking at Mattress Mick and trying to understand.
But you see, there you
Sorry.
go. That's a perfect example. Like that's a remarkable documentary to me. But it's
Mattress
like,
Man, yeah.
yeah, and I'd love to see this one. Or something like Tiger Sullivan's Great Wall, which I thought would have had
It's
international.
extraordinarily timely. And
It's a great documentary.
getting more
It
relevant
has
by the
worldwide
day.
significance, and like something like that should really have been in the mix at Oscars, in my opinion. But for whatever reason, it's not. I don't know if this can be done. It is the way it is, and that's that maybe. But it's obviously been intriguing for me.
All right, let's move on to talk about the year in box office receipts. So it's been
I'm so excited there.
I know, I can tell. There's enthusiasm just radiating from people here.
I
And
might sing.
You might sing.
Steady.
Well, we do have 4 musicals in the top 10, which
They
is
couldn't believe it.
which is quite an accomplishment.
The Irish have shown this year, for whatever reason, that we really love to go singing in the cinema.
It's worth noting, by the for all that everybody's declared that cinema's dead, and that for all that we're lauding the arrival of Netflix and the pumping of movies into your home cinema, in Britain, cinema attendance was up the highest since 1971, I
Yeah,
believe.
it's huge.
They need the escape.
Hey! Outstanding, Luke and Grace. Outstanding. But they do.
Quite
They
true.
Genuinely
they
do.
really do.
They really do.
Which is why that Cumberbatch thing is going to sink. The
Yeah.
HBO one.
What
Yeah,
was
yeah,
it, I think?
Oh,
Yeah,
The Brexit movie.
I saw the 30 seconds of the trailer.
Directed by Toby Hines. It's going to be
Dreadful.
They made a
fascinating.
Brexit movie starring
Benedict Cumberbatch as the coordinator of the Leave campaign. The trailer even does the Sherlock thing where he stares at numbers and they rearrange themselves to generate
awful
smiley
But
faces.
he's got a receded hairline. So
And he's got a
Oscars-
beer gut, hasn't he, as well?
Has he?
Oh,
Yeah, but it's a
God.
HBO
do
movie, so we're
the,
talking
do the
Emmys.
numbers rearrange themselves to 250 million?
That is grim.
51.9%.
And then all those numbers just disappear. It's the weirdest thing.
Yeah. How much a week? How much a week? But yeah, so let's move on and talk about the top 10 at the Irish box office. Do we want to take a guess at what's at number 10? It's entering its 51st week.
Greatest Showman.
Oh, fine. Yes, it is the Greatest Showman.
You did ask if you want to take a
I
guess,
did
but
ask.
you did,
51
yeah.
weeks
Nothing else
showing.
could possibly
Hang on,
have been in the
so
cinema
did-
for
this is
51 weeks,
2017?
in fairness.
Yeah. This is...
Yep.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
went.
it's
This came out in 2017.
Yeah.
I kind
is-
of enjoyed it as a film. I was
51 weeks.
Relatively speaking.
You saw it?
I
did,
don't
in the
know
end.
that it's
I know
bringing
the cinema.
such
I saw it
joy
at
to
home
that
release.
Many people.
Um,
Clearly, a lot of people are having a lot of fun with this movie.
I went to see The Greatest Showman on New Year's Day, I think, or
Oh my goodness.
January 1st or 2nd. I think
Jesus, Luke.
I went to see it at Cineworld. I think there was one other person in the cinema, which was Tara Lee, the actress. So, like, there was so few people there that I could recognize someone that I
You were
don't
like,
know.
this film's going to sink.
And yeah, I was like, well, The Greatest Showman's
going.
going nowhere. Like, I was
Well, it
very
showed
wrong.
you
Which is
upstart.
like the early word of mouth that then caught fire, and suddenly everyone was obsessed with it.
Yeah. Because then I think around June, I was walking home from work and somebody had headphones on as I was passing them by the Academy. and I could hear The Greatest Showman blaring, and I was like, "Who the hell's listening to
The Greatest Showman?
I think it was around,
Idiot still
I think it was around September that I finally realized.
This isn't going to wait.
This thing's got legs.
But I mean, I occasionally go to the Savoy and I'm walking down, and that little screen that's on the landing, the other one that's on the landing between the top and bottom,
Yeah.
it's almost always showing The Greatest Showman, which is astounding.
Yeah, because
You know what?
you
That's
can't
sweet.
see everything in a year, and how many times this year I've tried to catch something at last,
And have
it's
it escape
gone.
your
Oh,
grasp.
it's
Yeah.
just gone. But what is?
Yeah,
It's The Greatest Showman. It's fun, you know.
It's okay.
intense.
Songs are good. It's kind of weird. It skips over a lot of the kind of
Actual
unsavory,
history, yes.
thing of it. But
But you're not looking for
it's
that.
well made, and I kind of enjoyed it.
Yeah, that may be a recurring theme when we talk about musicals in this top 10.
No.
No.
We might get more negative or positive.
Yeah, me too.
Anybody want to guess what number 9 is then?
Gives a hint.
I know you're a mean one, Mr. Dunne.
Transylvania movie that we couldn't get rid of.
Already?
Grinch.
Really?
Yeah, already. It's not even Christmas. It's only been out for 6 weeks, and it's already earned
Grinch?
2.6 million. Thank you, Jay.
No, that's oh wow.
Yeah.
Actually, that's shot up, right? Hasn't it?
Yeah.
That's number one at the on Scannain, the top 10 of this week.
Of this week, yeah.
So
Oh,
it was hanging around 10. You see, it's
Yeah.
clever.
Wow.
Yeah,
They're clever.
This is the Greatest Showman approach to marketing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is it because it was released in mid-November.
I
'cause it's-
probably got quite a boost from the Cumberbatch Brexit film trailer. I'm sure a lot of people rushed to the cinemas.
If you like this,
But isn't that the story that Jeremy Irons tells about the success of Die Hard 3, where he's like, well, after I did The Lion King, I figured I should take another role where it's mostly just my voice on a phone, so the kids could recognize me. And you're like, oh, I love you, Jeremy. Don't ever change. At number 8, it's Black Panther, earning 2.9 million
and
euro.
that's run
Finally, some
worldwide.
good
Like,
news.
that's huge.
It's bigger in the States than Infinity War. It didn't do as well internationally,
No.
but it did well enough.
Did it do more business than any other Marvel film?
I believe so, yes.
Damn.
Which is good. Good for it.
good for Ryan Coogler. He can pretty much name any project
Right.
he has to do.
Yeah.
Like,
He's got quite a run under him now.
Yes. Good luck, insert name of director here, because at number 7, it's Bohemian Rhapsody.
I don't want to talk about
I
this.
still haven't seen it.
I won't see it.
It's terrible, and that
it's
so many
probably
people have seen it
legitimate,
as
so I'm
bad.
probably going to bring my mum.
I
to
can
it at some
understand
stage.
why people like it, though. It's very,
Yes.
it's the cotton candy version. It gives you a neat arc, even though that arc is, like, horribly offensive.
Cotton
but
candy's very bad for you.
but if you only eat it for 2 hours and 20 minutes a year, Luke,
You'll get sick. That's a terrible idea.
You go to see the Live Aid performance,
That's
and
it.
you get that, and it's a lovely game of dress up, except it's also grotesque and horrible and badly mounted. But it's fine, because there's 30 minutes of singing.
I really believe that you believe that, Ronan. It's fantastic. I can feel the enthusiasm. It is interesting that, yeah, a lot of, and this is one of the things where I think that there's, talking to people, it's a bit of a divide between critics and people who actually love the movie. Is that critics are like, well, this is a horribly offensive take on the life of Freddie Mercury that glosses over almost everything that made him unique and substitutes in a homophobic cliche storm. And, you know, fans are like, yeah, but the Live Aid sequence is amazing. And it is amazing. Like, it's a wonderful recreation of it. It's kind of interesting because I went to see Mary Poppins last night, which is opening this week. And I don't want to compare it to this, but it's in a sort of, it has that sort of in spectacle mode where it's designed to give you these musical showcase sequences in a way that evokes obviously the original Mary Poppins, but films from the 50s as well, that sort of musical style.
But
And it kind of, I wonder if this is like cinema trying to compete with event cinema, like
I think-
Andre Roux
Yeah,
or like
yeah, yeah.
Coldplay One Night Only. Or
It
whatever.
absolutely
Probably
feels
is,
like
yeah.
it's drawing on that kind of thing, but I think it's interesting in the context of sort of end-of-year wrap-ups. I've seen a couple of think pieces, people talking about how the movies didn't seem able this year to keep up with politics, and there's so much going on in the world that people want to go to the cinema and get pure escapism. Whereas a film like this, I think you can't divorce it from its politics, or at least I certainly can't, because I sit there and watch it and no thanks.
see, the thing about that is, like, The Greatest Showman glosses over P.T. Barnum and, you know, the true history of him, but he's been dead for like 250 million years, so it's fine.
Did you get that fact in a P.T. Barnum museum with a
yeah,
skeleton?
Exactly. But like, it's, if I've said on the 250 podcast that it's great that this has an audience and that people are enjoying it. That's great in and of itself. But this film is rotten to the core, and the knock-on effects of that are
Yeah.
are worse than I think the enjoyment that people are having of it in isolation.
This
You're
is
already seeing, for example, Duncan Jones has been on the timeline today saying that he had to have a meeting about who would be playing his father in a prospective film.
Yeah. Which was, by the way, a really great response. He looked for a way to tell them to go fuck themselves. He was thinking Meryl Streep. He was thinking Peter Dinklage. He was thinking Janelle Monáe.
And,
I vote for Janelle.
David Bowie is both larger in life and complicated. And I don't think the box office success of Bohemian Rhapsody is going to leave studios to go, well, that's the side we need to dry out.
The complicated one. Well, I mean, it's worth noting, by the way, that the next film that Dexter Fletcher will be working on is the Rocket Man Elton John biopic, which sends shivers down your spine.
No more. I know, like
Elton John at least is alive to sort of step in and go, hang on, that's incredibly offensive.
And again, if they don't use the John Lewis ad as their trailer, then what are they even doing?
At number 6, do you want to guess what's at number 6?
Another kid's
Because I'm going to guess it. Yep, it is indeed. Grace is correct. It is Peter Rabbit. So do we like Peter Rabbit more?
That
or
was
less?
this year.
Yeah.
a year and a half
10
ago.
weeks in the top
2015, I
10.
think.
10 weeks in the top 10, earning a total of 3.2 million
I'm not
euro.
believing any of that. No, I'm not having it.
I can't cope. My comprehension of time is just...
It's all over those Sky Movies ads.
Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
I take an objection to it being called a Christmas movie too. Like they're playing it there alongside like the Muppet Christmas Carol, and I'm like,
Die
how
Hard.
dare you? Like Real Housewives boys, how dare you?
At number 5, Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, which is half...
Again, how is that this year?
Yeah.
It's been a long year.
This year has been a decade long.
I have a soft spot for any Jurassic Park movie that turns into Nosferatu in its final half hour. It's like I feel like you've got the point where somebody's like, this movie's going to make $1 billion worldwide anyway. Just fucking do whatever you want there.
Are me and Darren the only ones that have seen this?
Well, I haven't. I'm not going to hear any of them after
It's
Jurassic World.
dreadful. Don't believe Darren. Sorry.
Yeah, I have to say.
I love how Luke's response was like, "Is somebody else going to jump on this?" No, I'll do
I
it.
don't want any part of it.
It's in at 5 in the box office. It's probably sitting around 3 in my top 10 Darren descriptions of movies that I will never see and enjoy Darren describing. So that's what I got out of it.
This has one of the stupidest plot twists I've ever seen in a movie. And do you remember when I was talking about Robin Hood a few minutes ago?
Church Casino Night.
Oh, Jesus.
At number 4, it is not Robin Hood.
Thank God.
It is in The Incredibles 2, or Incredibles 2, apologies. I got the, not the proper noun, apparently.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
I'm seeing this. Niall's persuaded me that I should last week in the podcast. I don't know. The sequels for
Pixar movies
are not generally good at all. So
this is one of the
it took somebody
stronger
to really persuade
non-Toy
me to
Story
probably
ones.
see it.
Yes, but it's also one of the lighter ones as well. Like it's a great action movie. It's a fantastic and spectacular.
It's a victory lap.
Yeah, that's it exactly. There's no
but
reason
it's
for it.
fun one, you know.
Yeah, it's enjoyable.
Don't ruin it. I was already up for it. Don't
I'm
roll
not
back
sure
now.
I would recommend it for Jay, but
Jesus.
at number 3 though, this will make you happy, Jay. Avengers: Infinity War.
AKA
Jay's
the film I
favorite
put into the
blockbuster.
250.
Yeah.
I really like this. We'll see how it plays out and how well it'll work beyond that, but I really liked it.
I'm very excited about the
It's
sequel.
probably been my favourite blockbuster of the year. But it also wasn't meant to define blockbuster. But certainly a favourite summer kind of blockbuster I've seen, I have to say, by some distance.
At number 2, and by the way, we should note, this is for the first time in the history of the Irish box office, 2 films have earned over €5 million, which is unprecedented. So, at number 2, it's A Star is Born. 1 in every 50 tickets for A Star is Born worldwide was bought in Ireland.
I'm so proud of this.
We have the highest
gone mad
population
for this,
density
haven't we?
of like enthusiasm for this movie.
It's merely
It
okay.
charts, it's off the chart in terms of social media.
Look around you on the Lewis. Most of these people have seen A Star is Born.
Well, that's when I knew A Quiet Place was a phenomenon. When I was on the Lewis and I heard 2 middle-aged women saying, "Oh, but it's not really a horror film. You could sit through it, no problem."
Our favourite argument about horror movies ever.
Yeah.
It's not really a horror film, but yeah, Star is Born, phenomenal.
It is.
It's done an incredible amount of business here. And people love it.
Bradley
And
Cooper's going to learn all the wrong things from that.
Bradley Cooper already believed in all the wrong things anyway, so it's only confirming
This is
what he
just
believes.
underlining them.
And it really is.
Have you seen that director's roundtable?
Oh god, the pictures, the Spike Lee
Spike
pictures are
Lee and
amazing.
Quaron and everything. Now, I
Spike
mean,
Lee looking at Bradley Cooper when he's explaining directing.
Oh,
for
no.
the Ages pictures. It's like,
Who else is at the turntable?
Quaron was there. I'm trying to think who else.
Was Chazelle there?
Adam McKay
I don't
giving his
know.
expert opinion, maybe.
Well, so of the contenders, who was there representing Bohemian Rhapsody? That's the real question.
Well, we know who wasn't.
The lawyers.
It's great. The for your consideration screen of Bohemian Rhapsody is amazing because it's the only one that says just vote for this one thing. Don't ask any questions. Just vote for Rami
Who
Malek.
directed?
Yeah. Rami Malek. That's all you need to know here.
Yeah.
My dad told me that he went to see A Star Is Born by himself. And I think that's a pretty good indication of the film really getting that kind of cultural appeal. He thought it was okay. He liked it more than I did.
I like that.
Yeah.
He's a good guy.
He wasn't
I've
that
always
keen in
said
it. He said he thought Lady Gaga was really great in it, and Bradley
agree with
Cooper
him
was
as well.
surprisingly good at singing.
It's not my favorite Lady Gaga film of the year.
Oh,
That Netflix documentary is pretty good.
Ooh.
I have to
As
admit,
these things go.
I'm actually quite happy that A Star Is Born hasn't had the inevitable Oscar season backlash to it, which is quite good. Like, it feels like people on the internet are
It has
still
a white
allowed
head,
to enjoy. It feels like people on the internet are allowed to enjoy A Star Is Born in a pure way. and I'm happy for them.
I guess.
See, this is where
I like
Cooper's
Star Is Born.
egocentrism comes in
I
handy.
might even have really liked
Because
it.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
I really like The Star Is Born as well. But all my contempt is laser focused on Bradley Cooper.
I'm fine with
Yeah.
that, though. I mean, I'm fine with that.
He can take that.
Isn't he? Isn't
He's the
there?
stalking horse.
He can
Like-
take those hits though.
It's
course he will.
surprisingly easy to pretend he's not there. It's just
But
like,
he
he's
keeps
just over
cutting
there in
back
the
to
background, like
himself.
dying and stuff, like whatever. But he's got
Spoiler.
a dog, and
oh, that dog scene, yeah.
yeah,
It's a great scene.
And at number one, I'm pretty sure we all know what this is, but do we want to say it anyway? Who wants to guess?
I've forgotten already.
Here we go again.
Boom, got it in one. Mamma Mia, baby.
Oh,
What
Something we
could
can all
it
agree
be?
on.
Yep.
something that makes Hellscape every year worth
€5.4
it.
million euro.
Number 9 in the Irish all-time box office star.
Yep, quite an accomplishment.
Number 9. I bought 6 tickets to this, so I'm glad to have done my part. It's
Well done,
great.
you.
It's absolutely terrific.
We may be hearing more about it later.
It has one
I
of.
saw it in Luxembourg, so I did not contribute to that.
Oh,
I'm fairly sure it did okay worldwide as well.
Yeah.
It had one of my favorite scenes of the year, which is that sequence where the boats arrive and
yes.
Stellan Skarsgård
Yes,
It's
is
amazing.
It's the most joyous thing
Pierce
I've ever
Brosnan,
seen.
who can't dance but doesn't care. He dances like nobody's watching. It's amazing.
He acts like nobody's watching. It's amazing. I love
See
him.
that's what separates it from some of those other films because at Mamma Mia's heart, even though it's a sequel and it's a jukebox musical and it's very economically driven, at its heart there's something pure there.
There is.
Yeah.
It's
You can't
decency
say the
and-
same for some of those other
I'd
films.
agree.
And it's also actually really well directed.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's incredibly well directed. I would argue it's better directed than Bohemian Rhapsody or A Star Is
It's
Born.
very well structured as well. Really well structured.
It's
I think
amazing.
It's worth saying that it's as much fun as it is, and it's a terrifically enjoyable film. It has got, by Hollywood standards, which isn't saying much, but it's got a pretty mature sexual politics to it.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on under the hood there. That it's not just a whole bunch of fun.
Yeah.
I'll-
It's a film about a woman who sleeps with 3 men over the course of 3 days that refuses the slut shamer, which is like that shouldn't be a high bar to clear, but for modern Hollywood films,
For Hollywood, we're
we're doing
decades
very well.
ahead.
Yeah, it's
And like Lily James, that's one of the strongest performances
She's
in
great.
a
Yeah.
blockbuster film, this
in
year.
any form, in any
When you
film,
finally
I
put her
think
in a
she's
good
fantastic.
movie, it's amazing what she can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, she is in one of my top 10 films.
Oh dear God, please don't.
She's
tell
in one of
me.
my top 10 films, though.
Okay, well I imagine it's a different one.
No.
But just to say
It's
that
Darren
this,
Mooney.
Yes, I do. Probably.
the success of that, the fact that that's number 1 at the box office ahead of Avengers, and even that Star Is Born is there at number 2. It's an indication that even with massive studio backing and advertising and all these things, word of mouth is what went out there, which is quite heartening.
And I think it is also, it ties back into that idea of spectacle as something that doesn't just involve cities being destroyed. Sometimes it involves Pierce Brosnan leading a fleet of ships to rescue his daughter's hotel opening.
This is where I agree that critics don't matter because, no one's ever
This
going to be
has been
convinced
pretty
to see
well,
these films
received,
on my say so.
Well, I mean-
no, it has.
Like
But
it has
this is a film that people can convince each other to see.
Yeah.
The same for A Star Is Born and some of those other films. Whereas, nobody's going to go see Cold War's great, but nobody's going to go and propel it to the top of
I
the...
really feel like critics are writing for themselves and each other. They're not really writing for audiences anymore. Audiences talk to each other about what they want to see and whatever people are ranting about on Facebook.
Well, some critics.
Because ordinary people don't use Twitter. Let's be real.
I think, I think that's true.
That's accurate.
But I think there's still good critical writing there out there that takes these films that are doing well and looks at those and what works about them. I think endless think pieces are kind of maybe
Exhausting.
It's a churn.
Yes.
Described it, and I think that's fair.
All right, then. So before we jump in to talk about the top 10s, does anybody have any superlatives they'd like to throw out this year? Anything like your favorite scene, your favorite moment, your favorite one-liner, anything like that before we jump in?
That scene in Mamma Mia 2, which we probably can't say because it's a bit spoilery, but the scene that has Meryl Streep in it
Yes.
is incredibly
My
well.
stars.
And
Tears,
I just
tears,
feel
tears.
for anyone who has to be spoilery, I'm sorry. If anyone has ever lost a parent, I just feel like that scene is going to be impossible for them to ever look at. So, enjoy it while you can. Enjoy is the wrong word.
I'd like to hand out my annual "You Almost Got Me in There" trophy to Emma Thompson for her
The Children Act.
The Children Act. Her
She
very
did get you in there.
She
You were
did,
very
yeah,
excited.
that's
Myself, you
exactly
and
it.
Graham, we podcasted early so we could go bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, enthusiasm. We danced up the escalator. It was beautiful, and then the movie started.
Yeah, it did, didn't it?
Yeah.
It almost got me in there, then almost got me through the film, which is terrible. Laughably terrible. And Emma Thompson is there with such heart and verve that you're like, I buy this. No, oh wait, no, I don't. She is the queen, but even she can't save this.
All right. So we jump into the top 10?
Yes.
Okay, so Luke, do you want to start us off with your number 10?
Yes, 1 second.
Okay. Now, what will happen, listeners? So we have very few rules. So you can nominate a Netflix film, a TV movie. We draw the line. Anything north of Twin Peaks is a legitimate entry on this particular top 10. Also, what we're going to do is if it's on multiple lists, we're going to discuss it at the highest possible point, so as many of us can take part as possible. So if you hear somebody on the podcast mention a film and we move along very quickly, that means that we'll be coming back to it later on.
No, but going back and forth.
Rather than going back and forth in it.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense.
Luke, do you want to open for us at number 10?
So at number 10, I have got To All the Boys I've Loved Before, which
nice choice.
I really, I caught this quite late, actually. I only saw it a couple of weeks ago, but I really, really enjoyed it. It's one of several kind of romantic comedies that have come out this year in particular, and for the last kind of year or so, that it's a great romantic comedy in its own right, but it takes that genre and recognizes the qualities that all the best ones have always had, but over the kind of 80s and 90s and early 2000s, people really turned against and kind of became very cynical about. It doesn't make a big show about doing that, but it does it to great effect. Love, Simon is another example of that, or
the setup.
Set
Set Up.
Is it Set It Up or The Setup?
Set It Up.
Set It Up.
I've been confusing that for months now.
Well, this is a great example of Netflix filling gaps that that have been created in the release schedule, because these are films that people don't think will do well at the box office, but which do phenomenally well through word of mouth.
And giving it to a female writer and director and allowing them to cast an Asian American lead.
And
Something studios were not going to allow.
part of what I think turned people against romantic comedies over the last couple of decades is flaws in the writing. Yeah, things like this, where not only are those things problematic in and of themselves, the fact that when you really think about it, this isn't romantic, it's kind of creepy and such, but people, finding themselves really clever for noticing that. I think the internet age really kind of
Snark. It turns snark into currency.
Yeah. But this doesn't care about that at all. It's writing from a different perspective, so it avoids a lot of those problems. The characters in it are really charming.
They're really sweet and really lovely.
The film is really well structured, and it does similar things with its structure that other films have done in much more showy ways, and carries it off with more finesse, I would say. And again, the acting, not showy. All these characters are very believable, very charming.
Really nice relationships. Which I really like.
It's the kind of film that, give me more of this.
Netflix have been doing well with this, and I think, again, when we talk about what the studios are doing and not doing, this is where the shift happens, where Netflix have spotted, or whatever, cynically exploited a part of the market that somebody else is undeserving.
Yeah.
And are putting films out that people are going, all right, yeah, I watch this, and I'll watch another one when it comes out next week or 2 weeks later. But they're, as Grace already pointed out, they're directed by women largely, and kind of starring people of colour and stuff like that. That's important and it matters. And studios aren't really doing a lot in that space.
Yeah.
And romantic comedies are great and done well.
Yeah, and I think this is, you know, like I say, there are other good examples of this type of romantic comedy over the last couple of years. I think this does all the good things that they all do
And
together
more.
in one. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, so Jay, you're number 10.
Yeah, I suspect this won't be on anybody else's list, so we're okay. My number 10 is Madeline's Madeline, which is a film that I don't think has got a release here, but I saw at the Fla, which is Josephine Decker film. A really, really interesting, absurd, exhausting kind of. It's kind of like Fame, if you remember Fame in the 80s, shot like a horror film, and lost in a kind
Oh
of
yes, I
haze
remember this.
of,
I remember this, yes.
and it's a kind of a haze of kind of disintegration and reintegration and a kind of battle for the soul of a young girl between her mother and her kind of dance teacher, played by Miranda July, weirdly. And this kind of battle for somebody's kind of love and respect, and then that person find themselves, and the lead actress is Helena Howard, who's absolutely dazzling. I thought would have been in the mix maybe for some awards kind of notice. I think the film's got a kind of couple of mentions here and there, but not really. I think it's a little too kind of below the radar a little bit.
It also sort of arrived a bit early, I think.
Yeah, I
saw
think
it
so. I
as
think
part
that's
of
also true as well.
It got sort of sent out around June, July. I think it was trying to gather momentum.
Yeah, there's some absolutely astoundingly shot sequences throughout the film. There's 2 or 3 kind of longish takes and kind of variations of kind of somebody losing it a little bit in kind of in theater and kind of trying to find a character and in essence find themselves. And the film kind of makes it kind of difficult to connect to quite purposely. I think it's aiming to kind of a head spinner a little bit, but there's so much extraordinary stuff in it that it's incredibly difficult to dismiss and kind of think that it's being arty for art's sake or something. I think there's something I get something really interesting. It doesn't really care too much about plot at all, really. It's just kind of it's interconnected scenes a lot of the time. But I kind of watched it, and I think it's probably about an hour and 40 minutes or whatever. And I kind of came out of it wanting to watch it again, which is one of those kind of rare things that you don't want to see what else is in there once you've taken it all in the kind of first viewing. So I will be catching that at some point, and I'd love to see it again in the cinema if I could, because it's one of those films that's a feast for the eyes. Like, it's absolutely gorgeous. And I don't know if it's going to get released here. I might have a 2019 kind of thing. I don't know.
We are very loose in our top 10,
sometimes
as we mentioned.
Yeah,
it's basically
like-
anything we've seen that we can legitimately count.
I mean,
as a
I
movie.
thought about leaving it if there was a kind of if there was 2019 release, but I couldn't see anything, so it's going in because Niall's not here.
This is yeah. Who's going to stop you?
Niall.
Well, Niall is here in spirit because we
Yes,
have
he
his
is.
top 10, but we'll come back to that. Ronan, what is your number 10?
And my number 10, something I think and hope is appearing elsewhere, is Tamara Jenkins' Private Life.
Yes, I may be mentioning that at some point.
All right, so we'll come back to that one
No,
then.
I'm not actually.
Oh, okay, so I guess we're going to talk about it now.
Jason.
That was a roller coaster
Hang on,
of a
sorry.
discussion. Wow, okay. This is betrayal.
Something's
This-
gone wrong on my
Jason's
Drama.
got a previous draft printed.
This is what happens when you tune in. This is exciting. This is live radio, people.
I don't know what's happened.
Are we going to talk about it now?
I feel
Or...
like that Kent Brockman moment where the thing.
You just Warren Beatty, the podcast.
And the winner is La La La.
I don't have a list there, but it's probably in my top 10. But from go for it.
All right, Ronan.
This is a disaster.
Well,
It's
you
in my
have
top 10.
10 places and it's not there.
You were, yeah.
It's a mistake. There's been somebody in my research team is going to get fucking
Very
shit
huge
canned
mistake.
tomorrow.
Jay's research team consists of Jay.
Yeah, I'm going to get fired tomorrow.
But Ronan, tell us a little bit about Private Life.
Private Life does this extraordinary thing where the final scene carries on underneath the closing credits, and in many, many ways, and I think this is the intended effect, has carried on in my head since. It is a film that lingers with you for a long time, and I suspect I'll still be thinking about this in a couple months' time. It's really, really stayed with me. That is kind of the effect of its 2 central performances, which are absolutely astonishing. I made the point when I saw it a couple of months back that these 2 characters share maybe 2 scenes of tenderness together. The entire film is based around conflict in their relationship, but such are the performances that it just is this lived-in romantic feel to it, where you know that kind of interaction people have, where they have spent enough time with each other that you can see the affection through the sort of conflict. And it's beautifully pitched. Jenkins' direction is absolutely wonderful, so understated that it just adds to this sense of underlying romance. And it's a really mature emotional drama that doesn't have any big moments where it easily could have. There are many versions of this film out there that have big Oscar clips. This film isn't that. And I really respected it for that. I don't think I realized I liked it that much when I first stopped watching it. And it's
grown with you.
It really, really has. I think about it an awful lot.
Sign.
Yeah, it's great.
And again, that's a Netflix-specific movie.
That is a Netflix movie.
That is on my 50 films for women list, but it's somehow didn't get into
now on Jay's top
Jay's
10.
idiot.
Happening in real time, ladies and gentlemen.
I mean,
Jay had an entire year to prepare for this podcast, ladies and gentlemen. He has a piece of paper.
Jay's had a tough year. Okay,
Everybody
Private Life's amazing. It's wonderfully put together. The script is hysterically funny and extremely moving. It's got the best final scene of any film this year by miles, in my opinion, and open to whatever interpretation you see it as. And it's three of the great forms, actually, because the girl plays the kind of younger kind of surrogate's great. That's Kaylee Taylor. I can't remember her name. She's very good. And Scannain and Paul Giamatti are incredible. This is the kind of thing that could become insufferable in the wrong hands. And you really, really know you're in the right hands when not only have empathy towards them, but genuine moving kind of thing towards it. I've said Tamara Jenkins is a great director. I've been saying it for yonks to anybody to listen on this podcast and everywhere else. And everybody should watch her films. She's fantastic.
I laughed so hard it echoed, and I was in a very small cushioned space.
Yeah, so my top 10 films would be now a top 11 films. So we'll say that as a joint number 10.
All right.
Now, but I don't know where it's going to land.
That's what
Jesus,
I did. I made a top 5 and then a list of sort of, honourable mentions that I can't be bothered to rank. Because
do you have 5 of them? We can slot them in. I won't count them towards the tally that we're doing. So if you want to pick 5 and we'll cycle through, because otherwise it's going to be really awkward. And it's like, so the 4 of us have, number 10 through number 6 and Grace has 5.
I mean, I can think of like 2 or 3 offhand. So Free Solo is outside my top 5, but I loved that.
Okay, cool.
And Mission Impossible Fallout.
Well, we're going to talk about that in a moment.
What else? BlacKkKlansman, Creed 2, and Infinity War. We'll
come back to at least one of those.
I regret to inform you that Mandy is on my honourable mentions list, which I know is most of you.
Won't horrify me.
All right, so just
various other ones.
Quickly then, Coco is Niall's number 10.
I like Coco.
Niall is the parent here.
Yes.
Closest I came to crying in the cinema this year.
There's an interesting one, because we did have this discussion off mic about how close people came.
I'm a robot.
Very close. And then went further.
I'm a wreck these days. I cry at everything.
All right, and my own 10 is Mission Impossible Fallout, which is just a phenomenal piece of blockbuster.
I've got that one higher.
Oh, okay. Well, then we'll come back to that later. So let's move on to number 9. At number 9, it's Luke.
I've got Suspiria here, actually, which might be a bit of a Marmite pick.
Controversial.
Suspiria for me worked like gangbusters. I'm a bit of a history nerd, so all the post-war rottenness underlying in German society, and the way that's reflected in the sinister goings on literally taking place underneath this German institution. All that worked quite well for me. I've seen people say that they don't understand why that stuff is there. The post-war stuff. Yeah. That I don't know. Like I don't mean to question that in anybody else, but that to me is so clear.
Horror movies are typically about those fears that you don't articulate that simmer beneath the surface, and it makes perfect sense for it to be there in that context.
And what I like about Suspiria is that it draws that out, but it does it in a way that's not as condemnatory as it might be. Like, horror movies are typically very blunt when they draw these comparisons, but to get a little bit spoilery, when we get to the end and that conversation takes place between one of
One of Tilda Swinton's characters.
one of the Tilda Swintons and Dakota Johnson. There's not forgiveness there, but there's a kind of humanity to it that I was really not expecting in a bloody, and
Blood-drenched
kind of horror movie. That to me was really interesting, really engaging, and really unexpected. And this is, horror remakes do this in a way that other remakes don't do, even when they're cash driven. Not that I would call Suspiria kind of cash driven.
Yeah.
Because horror itself is always looking at not just trying to get you afraid, but looking at something more
Simmering beneath the surface.
They can look at different things. And it was good to me that this, as a remake, took Suspiria as a jumping off point to explore different ideas.
Well, very famously,
I found those ideas quite interesting, and I thought that they were well realized.
Its opening scene very famously sort of opens with the big twist from the original Suspiria, which gives it a whole bunch of places it can branch. It can sort of go and explore. It can take the starting premise, the end premise, the original Suspiria, and use it as a jumping off.
Yeah, and it's really kind of letting you know what you're in for right away. Yeah. Like the title card for Suspiria is so brilliantly put in this remake. On the side at the train station, and it's again, there are things that are hidden that are actually really clear if you're looking for them. I really enjoyed Suspiria a lot.
Perfect.
And it was creepy.
Unfortunately, it's on my endless catch-up list.
And at number 9 for Jay.
At number 9 is Phantom Thread.
Are we going to talk about that later with anybody?
Yes,
we are. All right. So, Ronan, what is at your number 9?
And number 9 didn't get a cinema release, but it kind of did. It was at a festival and had a one-off the IFI, but did enjoy a limited run on Mubi. My old friend, Dawson City, Frozen Time, which I know a bunch of us have seen.
Just missed my list. I think it was number 11 or 12.
Yeah.
Or number 13, depending on how many films I put on my top 10. But yeah.
Also known as a brief history of capitalism through cinema. Yeah. It's remarkable. It's
remarkable. And those things have always been intertwined, but the way the film draws it together through this really strange story and takes a very specific situation to turn it into something expansive about the world we live in is remarkable. I found it absolutely intoxicating when we saw it. Diff, and I think we all saw it together for the first time. It's, I think, a little north of 2 hours. It flew by for me.
Yeah.
There's something about the score and the sort of... It's mostly comic films that they show, these old films that were unearthed under an ice hockey rink in or is it somewhere in Canada?
I thought it was
Alaska.
Alaska.
They're mostly comic films, but I think Jay made the point quite well around that time that there's something strange and eerie about the way you see those faces of people who are now long dead.
Yeah.
And that kind of connection you make through the screen across the generations.
That cinema does.
Yeah.
Kind of way, even for long ago.
Yeah, and it between that and the score, which is by far one of the best scores of this year, I think, it really put a spell on me. I was completely with it for that pretty lengthy running time. I've gone back to it a couple times since. I think I saw it 3 times in the course of this year. Yeah, I absolutely adored it. It's a really good sort of brief overview of the history of cinema, but as you say, it gets tied up in the way the world has developed and the way personal interests intertwine with sort of community entertainment.
I mean, it does this wonderful weird thing where it seems to intersect with the social history of America through the 20th century.
And stuff.
Operating a brothel and stuff like that, or even the baseball thing in the middle of it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like it's all these little branching stories. It's one of those great sort of things that documentaries do about like human interest, where it all seems to just sort of.
And I think it's structured absolutely terrifically. That it has this air of a mystery that throughout the whole thing you're going, what happened here? What's going on? And you have these little side characters, the people who found it, who have their own little side plot going on in a really wonderful way. But it also feels as if somebody sat down and, clearly plotted this out. Bill Morrison is the director, and he's a terrific documentarian. This is really remarkable.
It's really interesting thing, actually. Like, I remember seeing it, and I've only seen Los Angeles Plays Itself, which is a
Tom Anderson's response to LA Confidential.
Yeah, and various other kind of...
I know, but LA Confidential was the one that sort of set him off.
Well, the Los Angeles Plays Itself is very good, and this is kind of like a Klondike Plays Itself element, because it kind of fits that kind of thing in, which I kind of like. was these are not our stories; they're part of our story now.
Yes, and we can use the footage and sort of it that way.
Which I liked.
All right, so in terms of number 9, Niall has at number 9 Michael Inside, an Irish film, which is quite...
Didn't make my top 20. It's somewhere in the 20s, 30s. I really liked that. Not quite as much as
Niall
previous,
did.
and previous
Ballad on Lullaby and
Frank
stuff like that, yeah.
Perry's films, which I preferred, but it's still really good.
It was pretty strongly in contention for mine. It was very, very, very difficult to cut it. I really, really like this great performance from Leila Raddy and Daffy Flynn, of course.
Yeah.
And very tightly framed. It's beautiful.
My number 9 is BlacKkKlansman, but I suspect we're going to be talking about that later. So, are we?
Well, I'm not.
Okay, we are indeed. So, let's move on to number 8. Luke, what is at your number 8?
I've got Annihilation here. I don't know if
we're going to talk about that later. So, Jay, what is your number 8?
All right.
Try not to sound so surprised and or alarmed.
Okay. My number 8 is Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again.
Hey!
Has anybody else got that?
Nope.
Oh, Jesus.
So let's talk about Mamma
Sorry
Mia,
to
Here We
say
Go
it didn't
Again.
like
Okay, I
it,
mean, we've
man.
talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to spend too long on it. This is one...
Cut to 20 minutes later.
So similarly to... Yeah, tears. Similarly to Ronan talking about Dawson City. I've watched this 3 times. Since
Yeah.
it's out. It's one of those films that I think I saw and kind of really needed at the time I saw it. Which, because it has this kind of cathartic, wonderful thing that just kind of... Jesus, thank God, I needed that.
It's so joyous.
It is joyous, and it's elevated and deepened by the kind of structure that it uses to add so much to it, like motion and really good casting for the most part, particularly the young cast. But Lily James really, really makes the film, like really makes it. I don't know if it needs the whole Sharon Garcia thing.
No.
But I'm kind of glad it exists.
It's so ridiculous
it
that
is.
every time Fernando comes on and repeat, I'm
bonkers.
thrilled.
And every time I watch it, I don't forget, but I'm always thinking, this time it's not going to happen. I swear. Which is, because I've seen it, but it does keep happening. But I kind of love it because it's like, it's heightened. Now let's see, we can go further. We can go all the way.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the wonderful thing about Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again is that it is that joyous kind of, you need it kind of happy experience, but it's a joy that acknowledges that there are things
that are not joyful.
I mean, I had tears. It caught me.
It's a Wonderful Life. There's a comparison that I would draw where, in the sense that there is an understanding that there is sadness, and that doesn't just come in at the end.
It's running through it.
And Lily James's performance really brings that out as well, because she is playing a character who loves life and has a joyous sex life and all the rest of this, but she does experience setbacks. She is listless in certain ways, and she gets to this point and gets through these things. And that she does it is an indication of where Amanda Seyfried can and will and does go.
It's the Godfather 2 of Mamma Mia sequels.
Yeah,
it's also like Grace already mentioned that scene, and that scene actually kills me every time I watch it. The Meryl Streep scene, and Ronan has mentioned that Pierce Brosnan kind of reclaiming his own song.
It's extraordinary.
It's amazing. I mean,
SOS isn't a joke anymore.
No, it's not. Absolutely not. And I think he's absolutely correct. I absolutely adored it. It did start higher on my top 10, and I thought by the end of the year it would slip back to somewhere around 20, where maybe at some point it may end up. But at this moment of time, it's my top 10. I absolutely adore it.
Ronan, you're number 8.
Oh God, not prepared.
Wait.
I know. I've had lots of notice, but I'm not a professional. At 8 for me, Rosie.
Ooh.
We will be talking about that.
We will be talking about that later then. So, at number 8 for Niall is Cold War.
Just outside my own list.
Yeah.
I briefly mentioned that Cold War is one of those weird films which I hugely admired, and one of the very, very rare times a film needed to be longer. Yes, I know, right?
For you to say that.
I know,
and it's already over Avarda.
I'll just say that this is terrible.
I really liked it, but it missed something for me. I didn't quite connect to it, and I think the way it told its story.
beautifully made, but for me, I didn't buy the lead couple's romance at all. And then, like, the film hinges on them doing things that require an incredible, timeless love story.
Yeah, and
I
it
don't
didn't get
buy
that. It didn't have the time.
Yeah.
And
No, I don't think it's- ironically, they had
I
that.
think genuinely that's an issue there. I take your point. And
it looks stunning. It's absolutely
Yeah.
amazing. It's one of the best looking films that I've seen this year. The framing is fantastic.
Yeah.
He does this thing where he frames them as if they're in widescreen but shoots them in 4.3, which means that you have this huge empty space over all of your characters, which gives this sort of impression of something unspeakable hanging over them, which works
Yeah.
beautifully.
But I felt completely detached from it.
Yes, I also
And
felt that.
I admired it.
Did it leave you a little cold?
Yes.
Thank you.
Very. Thanks, Luke. But no, it didn't quite work for me, and I did like it, but no, I'm afraid no.
I think it's interesting that I almost had the same reaction, but I think the film is doing something weird with that, where there's a hint of warmth in the relationship, and it's the only warmth they have in life, because there is nothing else in their
I
life.
get that. I think you're probably correct. It just needed a little more room.
For me, Cold War was the story of one guy wearing the same suit for 10 years. Sorry, that's
Great
very...
stuff, Darren.
But anyway, so my number 8, and I suspect we're going to be talking about this later, is You Were Never Really Here.
That may well come.
That may
That's coming up.
It's coming up.
Okay, so
Don't worry about it.
It's there.
It's really here.
Yeah. So at number 7, what's at number 7 for you, Luke?
I have got The Little Stranger here, actually.
Do we have that higher? Does anybody have that higher?
I don't, but it almost made my top 10.
Okay,
It's at 11.
Let's talk about The Little Stranger then.
This might be my favourite Donald Gleeson performance, and he's got quite a few good ones.
I think it's pronounced Dumble.
About time.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Sorry.
Yeah, this is like a really good book, where the longer you get into it, the more drawn in you kind of find yourself. This isn't the kind of film I necessarily am drawn to. These like stuffy British.
The real horror is the class system, Luke.
Yeah, if you pitch that to me, I'd kind of roll my eyes and be like, oh boy. But these characters are really well realized, and this exploration of the characters themselves and the kind of wider meaning of what they're going through, I thought was really well done, and it's kind of one of the understated directing performances of the year, I think. This is some really impressive stuff. Because, you see, I'm a hypocrite here. We've talked on the podcast before about how, this is a horror that's not really a horror.
Elevated horror in inverted commas.
Yeah, and how...
I think is why I didn't like it very much.
Yeah, and that all really worked for me. I was never, afraid or even tense, but it's the unnervingness of it.
It's chilly.
Yes.
I think that's what's the most effective part.
And that is understated, and that works with the themes that the story is going for. Whereas, I watched The Haunting on Hill House on Netflix, or tried to this year, and that is an actual horror. That is telling non-horror stories, and I couldn't get through it for some reason. I'm a big hypocrite here, because I was like, it's not scary enough.
You didn't get to that scene in the car, did you?
No, I had jumped ship by that point.
You would have jumped ship if you got to it.
Yeah, literally.
But
But this, you see, my problem with Hill House, not to go on a tangent, was that I was 2 hours in and I wasn't scared at any point, and I was like, I just don't have the time. I could well get drawn in at a point, but I just didn't feel that I had the time. Whereas with this, even though I wasn't afraid, or anything like that, these characters were so interesting to me, and Gleason's performance in particular, as this person that is nominally the protagonist, but is actually quite
monster.
sinister
But that's
in several different ways.
Yeah.
In and of himself and in and of what he represents. That really drew me in. And I thought, I was really impressed by it. Because I wasn't expecting a great deal going in.
Yeah, but it's been
It got sort of muted responses. Like, there was a lot of hype around it
Bad
before it
marketing
screened,
as well.
and then it arrived at Venice. Muted responses, marketing. I think the trailer was and you can't blame the marketing department for being, how the hell do we sell this?
just didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know what to do with it.
But anyway, at number 7, Jay.
Oh yeah, shit.
Again, we have had already an hour and 20 minutes of this podcast in prep.
Number 7 is The Tale, which may come up again. I'm not sure where.
Nope, the
No?
tail is
Oh.
not coming up.
Oh.
It's in my teens. It's number 15 for me. This is Jennifer Fox.
Jennifer Fox.
Apologies.
Film. It's a HBO film made.
Laura Dern.
And Isabel Nalise. Or Nalise, I'm not sure.
It's a phenomenal piece of work.
This is a film that really caught me by surprise. I'd heard good things about it, and kind of really wanted to watch it, and I watched it, and it has this remarkable thing going on where you get the two performances. Isabel Nalise and Laura Dern are playing essentially the same character, a younger girl and an older woman, and it's about events that happened when the girl was younger, and I don't want to give too much away. It's one of these things that it kind of continuously asks questions about what people tell themselves to cope with situations in their lives, and how that infects and impacts on both their younger selves and their older selves, and what they have to do to kind of try to gain control of their own lives. It's technically stunning, like technically unbelievably well made, really beautiful, really smart. It makes really strong and smart stylistic choices all the time, and does really interesting things with the character and characters.
And it's also this thing where it's a weird blending of documentary as well, because it draws on her own experiences.
Yes, it does. It's very playful in that regard.
She's like Laura Dern is playing a fictionalized version of the director.
Yeah, the Jennifer Fox. Yeah, that should mention that the issues. It's our own story.
And then I think the film becomes an example of what it is, which is this idea of the stories that you construct in order to help you process the stories that you're dealing with. So this becomes, for a documentary filmmaker, a way for her to tell the story.
That tells it once removed.
It's absolutely fascinating. I really
and what's really interesting about it is that it has this kind of on the surface calm approach. Like, it's shot kind of in a really calm way that almost you cannot see the frantic paddling under the water underneath, and which is riveting and disturbing and extremely harrowing. And it's just it's extraordinary. I hoped it's one of those films that I wanted to see how I could go and rewatch, but I didn't get a chance to. But it's absolutely remarkable and really, really worth seeing. And we're kind of checking it out if you haven't seen it.
Perfect. Ronan, you're number 7.
My number 7. All right.
Whenever you're ready, Ronan.
Anytime. No need to rush you here.
No, no.
My number 7. You Were Never Really Here, which we will come back to.
We're going to come back.
Higher and higher, baby.
Keep on climbing. So at number 7 for Niall, first of all, is Rosie. Are we going to come back to Rosie?
We are.
We are indeed. And my number 7 is Widows.
Hello.
Hello.
Widows was in hot contention. It was sitting around number 12 for me, and I was really, really sad to leave it off my top 10 list.
Well, I'm glad to do a service.
Me as well.
Yes, hey.
Very convincing, Jay. Very
places, lads. It's close.
Astonishing. It's that wonderful sense. It's an incredible piece of pulp filmmaking that's also very smart. It's very shrewd. It's got things to say, but it understands that having things to say doesn't mean that it can't be pulpy and trashy and fun and highly enjoyable. It has a set, probably my favorite ensemble of the year. When I was filling out my ballot for the end of the year in terms of actors and actresses in particular, I think 3 of the 10 slots went to Widows. It's just a phenomenal piece of work. Viola Davis is fantastic. DeBecky, who's also in The Tale, which we just talked about, she's also great. And Eviro, who was also very good in
Bad Times at the El Royale.
It's fantastic. It simmers through. It's got this, it applies a level of craft and skill to a pulp film that allows you to do things like that long take that follows Colin Farrell as he drives from the slums of Chicago that he nominally represents into the posh and lush suburbs, which is where he lives, which is just handily conveniently on the border of the zone and stuff like that. It's just wonderfully, impeccably well made. Those long takes, the wonderful sequences with Daniel Kaluuya, where he's playing Jatem, which are absolutely stunning. This recurring motif in Flynn's writing, this idea of ignorance and the idea that we blind ourselves to whatever in order to feel comfortable. We blind ourselves to impossible and unreasonable acts in order to feel comfortable in the world in which we live. Like the idea that the main character are blind to what their husbands were doing, but also the political circles. It's amazing. It's one of my favorite films of the year. I'm just really glad it exists.
Listen to last week's podcast for my full.
for
thing.
Jay's very strong
But
opinions on the
it
matter.
really, really wastes Carrie Coon.
Yes, which is a shame.
It's just-
But I mean, that's an issue where you have a cast that is that heavily staffed.
It's a bad
Like,
idea.
I forgot that Kerry Coon was in it
So did
when
she.
I rewatched it. Oh, boom. All right, so let's move on to our number 6s.
What have I got? Sorry, I got The Shape of Water here at number 6.
Nice.
which I
That
really
was
did.
this year.
Yeah,
That was, in
Wow.
fact, this year.
What a year!
The Shape of Water is kind of a miracle to me. You know, it's and the kind of miracle that you can get out of great or really good filmmaking. Because the idea that Guillermo del Toro would get to make a film this self-indulgent, coming out of Crimson Peak, which was a big flop.
Critically and commercially. Like, in both senses.
And
Like,
I'll
it's
go
not-
to bat for
critics-
Crimson
No,
Peak.
I like
The
Crimson
critics
Peak as
are
well.
wrong.
I like
I will
Crimson
go to
Peak.
bat
It's a
for Crimson
beautiful
Peak
film.
very strongly. But the idea that he would get...
I love that the end of your Scannain podcast has turned into the Crimson Peak Appreciation Hour.
Every hour in my head is the Crimson Peak Appreciation Hour.
that he would get such free reign to make a film like this, which is basically Del Toro's entire cinematic perspective,
Interest, yeah.
and interests and proclivities. Well, maybe.
Careful
But,
there. Troy McClure, eh? I thought you
let's
said
say
he was
interest.
dead.
Let's say interest.
Yeah, let's say interest.
But all laid bare
Or fish.
with
Sorry, couldn't resist.
with a sizable budget,
Yeah.
and a very strong cast,
Yeah.
and musical numbers.
Yeah.
Well, a song and dance number.
Yeah.
That this is all in this one film that also found an audience
And also
and
what?
also was an Oscar success or an award success.
Yeah.
That's incredible to me, and it deserves all those things. It's not the best film that I've seen this year, but that it can do all those things and be so kind of touching and engaging, to me, is amazing.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe it's just because Del Toro comes across as such a lovable figure, but it's just, I'm pleased that he got that. Because, like, his whole career, and, you know, he's had hits, he's had misses and such, but his whole career is this kind of nearly man status where he's got all these ideas that never quite come to fruition, or projects that don't go anywhere, or projects that aren't fully realized, and so on and so forth. So this is like his big win.
Yeah.
That's amazing to me. Because it's about...
Yeah, it's grinding Nemo in the world of Stacey Groudon.
And,
It's a great call.
I
can't let the film pass on the podcast without mentioning that. It's just great.
Completely fair.
And I don't know if this is a better film than Crimson Peak, but, you know, if you're talking about the best films of 2018, this is more memeable than Crimson Peak, and that has been part of its
Currency.
success.
That is currency. All right. Oh, sorry.
Which makes it more, that just makes it more current in a very unexpected way.
And Jay, your number 6.
My number 6 is Rosie. Have we reached all the Rosies? Have we ring a Rosie?
Have we ring Rosies?
I actually haven't seen Rosie.
We have.
I
Okay.
haven't seen it either.
All right. So Outlook is Rosie. Let's talk about Rosie.
Rosie. This is the film about housing
family.
and lack thereof, and a family desperately looking to stay somewhere of a night, maybe even 2 nights,
Anywhere.
anywhere. And this kind of journey through the city, the various parts of the city, to various hotels, to various stopovers, to various cars, to various houses, constantly apologizing, constantly worried, constantly stressed. And it's harrowing and beautiful and humane and sad and anger-inducing and all the things you would expect. But what I wasn't expecting is Sarah Green's performance, which is my performance of the year. By anyone. I think she is astonishing and heartbreaking and beautiful and wonderful, and you'd want to save her. The cast grade in general, but she is astonishing in a film that could have been. It could have made mistakes. It's a tough line to walk, and to
It is indeed.
to get something right. And I'm not going to use the word entertaining, but to make a film that works really, really well
As a narrative.
but also makes its points succinctly without over egging it. I absolutely loved it. And it's something. It's one of the films I keep coming back to over and over as the year goes on, and I keep thinking of Green constantly apologising all the time, and almost automatically, because that's how her brain works now, because she's constantly not thinking, not concentrating on the moment, because she's
Well, it's a
constantly
sense
the
of shame.
future ahead, the future past, what's going on.
It's also the sense of shame that
Yeah.
she's made to feel for
Yeah, yeah.
the fact that she's in a situation
Yeah.
outside of her control.
Yeah. It devastated me, absolutely devastated. I thought it was absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I think devastation is the word. I was inconsolable throughout this film. And I was really glad that I was sitting closest to the screen, because I don't want people to see the state I was in. I was ruined by it. It's absolutely heartbreaking throughout, but never in a sort of cloyingly sentimental way, because it's sort of showing you the brutal reality of what's going on in this country in a very honest way. And it's really, really tough to watch. And I think that's why a lot of people should be watching it who aren't watching it.
All right, so Ronan, you're number 6.
I am not on the ball today.
Jesus, Ron.
I know.
It's
It's BlacKkKlansman.
It is. How do you know that?
I know things.
It is BlacKkKlansman.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Which is
it the
higher
highest?
elsewhere?
Is anybody else have BlacKkKlansman higher?
This just missed out for me.
Okay.
Same here, I was in my teens.
It's not in your top 5, is it? Okay, so BlacKkKlansman. Let's talk about
BlacKkKlansman
BlacKkKlansman.
up at number 6. BlacKkKlansman, I think, kind of took me by surprise in a way, because it uses the weight of the history of cinema so powerfully. There is that incredible cross-cut sequence with Birth of a Nation, where, Spike Lee is sort of speaking to the power of cinema in image making and the way that sort of shapes our culture, and very clearly with that scene saying that that film and the kind of culture around it has shaped our culture right up to now. And it feels, in a way, kind of joyous that this film is part of something of a revolution to sort of claw back the image-making power of the cinema.
That's it, because it's a counter-argument to that. Like Lee, and this is the thing where you have the criticism that Boots Riley's made of it, which is the argument that it's too optimistic, it's too hopeful, it's pro-police and that sort of thing. What Lee seems to be doing with this is he's proposing a better narrative. He's arguing that, like, the way that cinema is, and it happens throughout, where you have, for example, Toomey, who's talking about going to see Tarzan and internalizing racism for that. You have that scene where they're talking about the lynching that was inspired by Birth of a Nation. You even have the opening scene with Alec Baldwin where he's making that sort of horrible racial science documentary. And you have this idea that you have a culture that has continuously fed and enabled systemic racism. And Lee's response to that is, to point that out, but not to get angry about it in a way that you would expect, and he'd be justified to get angry about it, but instead propose an alternative to it, to suggest that we can use cinema that makes us better. That if cinema can make us worse, you can make us better through cinema, which I adored about.
I really like that. It was in my top 10 for a little while, but it slipped down as others came in, but it's just outside.
It's one of the strongest full stops in a film.
Yes.
I'd agree with that.
Not to pit these two films against each other, but a stronger full stop perhaps than Boots Riley's.
Yes.
Oh, we're going to come
absolutely
back
say
to that one.
Which is also a good film.
Yeah.
But this is a fictionalization of a true story, and at the exact moment where it gets at its most fictionalized, it hits you with the
truth.
current reality. In real life, this investigation went nowhere and was just closed off, and didn't get the catharsis that it
That's my point when I saw it. Like, that whole kind of takedown sequence is nonsensical and so heightened and so wish fulfilling, and this is how it would work in a proper fair society. And then this is what you get in reality.
If that on its own would be unsatisfying. But Lee is a smart enough filmmaker he's not doing that on its own. That's leading to
1-2 punch. That's great.
And it's a devastating punch.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
All right, so Niall's number 6 is First Reformed.
Didn't make mine. I did want to rewatch it because I was a bit detached from it when I saw it, but lots of it more.
I liked it very much, but I found as time went by, it sort of slipped down the rankings for me. It didn't quite stick with me. I think
Your opinion Reformed?
You could say.
Hawke's great in it.
Hawke is
great in it.
Phenomenal performance.
It is a great performance. And my number 6 is Sorry to Bother You, conveniently enough. Is that coming up later? I don't think it is.
No, it's very good, though.
It is.
I didn't see it.
I didn't like it very much.
I adored it. It's fantastic. It's this sort of like hyper 80s like sci-fi comedy thing that just throws a bunch of ideas at the wall in a way that I think reflects the way in which the world works now, where everything's just sustained, it's constant, it's beat. There's a wonderful moment in it where, like, after the characters have revealed the evil plot that Armie Hammer is operating on, don't worry because he's a tech bro, I didn't want you to think this was irrational. I didn't want you to think I was insane. This makes perfect sense. There's a video. But after that plan is unveiled to the world, there's a discussion where they're talking about how, like, when you present people with something that is so insane they have no frame of reference for it, the response is not mass panic. The response is always to keep your head down and get on with it, which for me is like this year in a nutshell.
That's very much this film's mission statement, and it states that out loud during one of the scenes that's more muted and more understated, where I forget the name of the character, but he says that when you have a problem that's too big for people to solve, they just get used to the problem. Yeah.
That's a fair point.
But that is where we are in 2018, where you have people who are like the situation. We get news from like our closest neighbor, where it's like, oh yeah, the army. There's 3,500 soldiers ready to stand by to quell unrest. How is everybody cool with this? The government will be the largest owner of refrigerators in the world because we won't be able to import food. And how is everybody cool with this? And you look at again, that's just our closest neighbor. You look over to the west, and things.
You could take the perspective on here and be like, the
homeless crisis
is so far out of control that people are just accepting it.
Yeah. I think that's
because they don't feel like it's possible to do anything meaningful about it.
And for me, that was what made it a movie for this year.
You can also play in Ireland as well, where we have these very big public moments of change that should be celebrated and are very powerful, but people en masse have a habit of going, and that's the end of the problem. And we've drawn a line under it, and aren't we great for having done that?
Homophobia no longer exists because we allowed gay marriage.
This film has a very good way of denying that, but I have issues with it. It's messy deliberately, but it's very messy. There are so many clunkers in this, and it's like I know that you're trying to be blunt, and I know that you're trying to be messy. That's all great, but there are too many jokes in this that just thud.
Yeah, there's one particular joke where I sort of head in hands and going, "Oh, who's laughing at this? Come on!" And nobody did laugh.
Probably me. This is my Lily James performance of the year, by the way.
Nice.
Thank you. But yeah, so we're going to welcome Grace in as we enter the top 5. So Grace, what is
She's alive.
She is here and present and live for one night only. Grace, what is your number 5?
My number 5 is Black Panther. Which is a wonderful, phenomenal film that was just like a breath of glorious fresh air when it came out. I was very much looking forward to this, not only because it's a Marvel movie, but obviously also because Ryan Coogler was involved. Coogler having built up quite a stock of goodwill, what with Creed and everything else. But I was really, really blown away by Black Panther, even for Marvel movies, which I generally tend to love anyway, and for a whole variety of reasons. But this one, compared to the rest of them, just was so distinctive, and the story that it told, and even though it was following quite familiar plot beats, especially for a superhero movie, the perspective that it took in it I found was really interesting, and also something that I feel in kind of the political undertones of it, something that seems very relevant to this year. There's a lot of conversation about Wakanda opening its borders and sharing its, technology and advances and progress with everyone, and then lots of conversations internally, obviously, about whether they'll just be overwhelmed with refugees and everything else, or whether it will be a good thing to help establish diplomatic ties and be a world leader and strive for excellence and all this sort of stuff. But even on top of all of that rich subtext, it's just really well written. The characters are fantastic. I think this is another film where the protagonist is, while being interesting, is still kind of the least interesting character in his own movie, which is a good sign. I think if you've managed to imbue all of your background characters with enough detail and depth to make them that compelling, and particularly Michael B. Jordan's character, the villain, is so well realized. And I think the fact that they clearly sat down and put a lot of effort into giving him a backstory that would resonate, and also making his politics or his ambitions, whatever you want to call them, his goals, so morally grey, where it's very easy to understand where he's coming from and why he's making the choices that he is, even if you don't necessarily agree with them. It just makes for such a rich viewing experience, and it's shot beautifully. Like, Coogler is such a stylish filmmaker. He's a joy. All of his films are a joy to watch.
It's interesting. I watched Creed last night, Creed 2, and watching Jordan's performance in that reminded me of Black Panther in the sense that I'd kind of forgotten how kind of political it was in terms of, like, as I was thinking about it today. It's full on, like, it's ferocious, and he's not wrong.
Oh yeah.
You know, and that's that kind of thing where you go, I can see this guy's point. Is pretty good.
really
That's pretty
enriches it.
interesting. And, like, the only issue I had with Black Panther was kind of the CGI heavy ending, kind of. But aside from that, like, I was with it pretty much most
I
of the
think
way.
it's kind of like an unfortunate bingo card that every Marvel movie is to end with, like,
I know.
stuff falling out
Yeah, I
of the
know.
sky.
It's a little
And
unfortunate.
it's also the fact that it's the exact same ending as Infinity War as well. It's a bunch of people in a field in. No, I know, but like right down to it's a field in the middle of Wakanda with a whole bunch of armies charging at one another.
See,
And we deliberately put it in the middle of nowhere, so, like, civilians aren't being injured, you guys.
Yeah.
I really want to rewatch it because I've only seen it the one time, and I was a little cold on it when it came out because of the CGI, which I had some big issues with. But it's like, how do you fault Googler for that? This is a film that 800 people have worked on, and those things aren't things that he would necessarily have
Things he did well
had
was very
strong
good.
involvement
Yes.
in. Particularly when you see Marvel talking to prospective directors for Black Widow and saying,
Yeah.
"Don't worry about the action."
We'll take care of that.
Very insulting.
Yeah.
But
And you have the directors going, no, the action's the part I want to do. That, like, I don't want to direct a Marvel movie to do an insane character study. Like, the reason why I'm coming to you, or why I would consider taking this meeting, is because I want millions of dollars to throw stuff at each other.
But what makes Jordan's character so great, people often talk about this Marvel villain problem.
Yeah.
And the ones that they cite are the Ronan the Accuser?
Well,
The
okay,
Guardians of the Galaxy one.
the one where you have all the nihilists. So you have, like, Melikath from Thor the Dark World.
Yeah.
You have Thanos, arguably, as, like, the super example of the nihilist. You have the guy you're talking about there,
But
Ronan the Accuser.
The Thor 2 one and the Guardians
Doctor
of the Galaxy
Strange
one
as well.
are the big ones. Yeah, and
The Doctor Strange
Caecilius.
one, I think, is the
Yeah.
most egregious.
but
But he's
Doctor
played by
Strange
Mads
is such
Mikkelsen.
like, it's not a good film.
Counterpoint to this argument. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Mr. It's Doctor, actually. Mr. Doctor? No, it's Strange. Oh, it is, but who am I to judge? That enough justifies Mads Mikkelsen in a Marvel movie.
I would disagree.
Oh, fine.
That to me is an indication of how these Marvel jokes are just circling themselves at this point. But what the problem on the face of it with those villains is that they're kind of like oblique and weird and not really used that much.
But they feel very detached from real life.
Yeah,
Whereas
because-
the perspective that Killmonger, which is a ridiculous name, but anyway,
I kind of like it.
the perspective that he brings is something that I think a lot of people will recognize and
Yeah.
really, really understand.
Yeah, because you have a sense of who he is
Yeah.
and why he's doing
What he's
anything.
Yeah.
And that's all anchored in a really great actor.
Yeah, so my sort of issue with Black Panther was, I think it was Grace was saying about T'Challa being the most boring character in his own film, but
I didn't say boring. I said least interesting.
okay, the least interesting character in his film, but it's that element of, Eric was right all along, but also like the weird element of like having the Martin Freeman character as the good CIA agent and stuff like that.
That
which-
was one of the reasons I want to rewatch it, because I had issues with that as well.
Yeah.
That's odd.
No, like,
So I think that there's more there that I maybe didn't see the first time.
yeah. Now, to be fair, it is in my top 30. I really, really liked it. It began in my top 10 and sort of crept down as the year went on. It's certainly in the top tier of Marvel films for me. And I really, really liked it. But anyway, at number 5, Luke.
At number 5, this is where I have got Mission Impossible Fallout,
Yay!
which is rad as hell.
It is, isn't it?
Rad as hell.
To use a technical description of what it is, it's astonishing. It is the best film in the Mission Impossible franchise. It took me a while to get there.
Cinematic use of the word prick ever.
Yeah.
Yes, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And
Best
hilarious.
third act I've seen in donkey's
It's
years.
a very good third act. That's the best I can muster.
Thank you, Jay.
Sorry.
It's got a good. Every act of this has one of the best action scenes I've seen in years. What can I say? And every kind of action scene that you can do, this movie's doing, which is ambitious and very. There's a lot of practical stuff in here. There's a lot of great CGI work as well. And it shows that you can use CGI work in an action movie of this kind and have it
Blend in.
yeah blend in seamlessly with
What you're doing.
practical work. And as action movie characters go, Henry Cavill, man, oh man.
As you described it, not even a whistle between his ears.
This Tom of Finland secret agent.
This is a man who rides away in a helicopter from a nuclear explosion, wondering if he left the heating on at home.
Big sexy idiot.
Yeah. It's astounding, and it's remarkable. It's like, again, this is Macquarie as the writerly director of the franchise, outside of Abrams maybe, but it's the only Mission Impossible film that actually feels properly structured, in that it constantly escalates. It goes from a relatively small sequence, which is the bathroom sequence, then it goes to the car chase, which is an escalation from that, then from the car chase to the rooftop chase, which is an escalation from that, and then it goes to 45 minutes of a 3-level cross-cut action sequence involving helicopters over New Zealand, which looks like Nepal. I mean, the movie was famously reverse engineered from that. I love that, like, apparently Cruise went to Macquarie and said, I'm learning how to fly a helicopter. You should do that in the next Mission Impossible film. And that's how the film worked backwards.
But this is how action movies should be. I mean, like, when you, like, Mission Impossible, the imagery that you associate with that is literally like a fuse burning down. An action movie of this nature should be structured in a way that the tension builds and builds. And it does that perfectly. Because again, even the action scenes that you're getting at the beginning and as they lead towards the end, they become more physical. The damage becomes either grander in scale or more tightly packed. You know, you're going from diving out of the sky to being stuck in a shed and literally in danger of, like, choking to death. A very physical, very present death, as opposed to through the sky. And just a very entertaining blockbuster, and similar, I would argue, to a film like Creed, in that it is ending on a high note. And it manages to it manages to build itself around a satisfying arc for Ethan Hunt, the character, through Tom Cruise's performance in the film. Tom Cruise, the maniac that he is.
The Daniel Day-Lewis of stunt work, ladies and gentlemen.
But without ever buying into the false premise that Ethan Hunt is an interesting character. Because it understands that Ethan Hunt, this is how you take a hot take on a character and actually build something productive out of it. Because rather than writing a think piece about how actually Ethan Hunt is a psycho, it uses that to build great action scenes, because there's nothing that this character won't do to do whatever it is he's trying to do.
And what I love about it is that Macquarie, and again, it's heavily influenced by The Dark Knight, right down to the Lorne Balfe score, the sequence in Paris where the truck gets knocked into the water and stuff like that. It's a very heavy influence. He's talked about it. One of the things that it does is it understands that, like, the best legacy of The Dark Knight as an action movie is not the moral ambiguity. It's not our heroes are darker and edgier and they talk in deep voices. It's the idea of, like, just doing the practical stunt work. And, like, what I really love about Mission Impossible Fallout is it takes that, like, Nolan-esque obsession with physical action and the cross-cutting. The cross-cutting of the climax, again, is very much in that style, and it applies it to what is an incredibly morally straightforward story. The morality of Mission Impossible is that Ethan Hunt does what is right immediately in front of him. It completely rejects this idea of darker and edgier. It repeatedly gestures towards it. It gestures towards moral complexity, and it's like, that's boring. Let's just get to the sequence where guys knock the socks out of stuffing out of each other in a bathroom. And I adore that about it.
What are those machines that, you know, they all, like, knock into each other, you know, that great inventors always have? You know, like Dick Van Dyke in
Newton's Cradle?
Yeah. That's this as a movie. Because, like, it's in service of what? You know? Nothing, really.
But it's nothing
joyous.
So tightly structured and impressively structured, and you can't help but get drawn in by those machines. This is very similar. And, the biggest shock I've had in a movie this year, and the perhaps the most entertaining acting I've seen, is Tom Cruise muttering wildly to himself about what a prick Henry. That's just, I would never expect that from Tom Cruise.
I'm disappointed. Write a letter to his.
Took a lot to get that.
And the birth of my greatest moment as a film theorist.
Well, this is
to be pretentious about it.
Little Dick energy is like, it's the auteur theory of 2018.
The PhD is coming.
Yeah.
The PLD.
Thank you very much. All right, so you're number 5, Jay.
Just saying, not for nothing is Mission Impossible my 58th best film of the year.
Oh, hey.
He has seen 59 films.
I have. No, I haven't. But what would number 5? We're number 5. Number 5 is Faces, Places.
Will we be talking about that later?
We may.
Okay.
All right, so Ronan, what is your number 5?
My number 5, which I'll also be talking about later, we're doing a bit of a trade-off here, is The Image You Missed.
Ooh, so there's a nice sense of, hey, have you guys been colluding on
We
this?
collude every year.
No collusion.
No.
Nobody has ever colluded less than me.
Fantastic Woman was Niall's number 5, actually.
That was not far out of my top 10. Really, really good.
It was around number 23, and it's one of 2 or 3 films, including First Reformed as well, that I kind of wanted to get back to see where I actually stood in it. Because I had kind of some issues, but I really liked it overall and lots of it, so I didn't get to it, unfortunately, because who has the time in this end this year?
So at number 5, my number 5 is, this is going to be fun, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri.
That was last year. Stop it.
That was this year, I'm afraid.
2015.
What's that this year?
That was this year. It was out in
Have at
January
it,
this
Darren.
year.
You're on your own here.
Long, cruel year.
Completely on your own.
It's a movie about anger. It's a movie about how anger corrodes and burns and infects, and anger causes us to do horrible and terrible things to one another, and how when it's directed without any purpose or any righteousness, when it just spreads outwards from a sense of lack of contentment. And by the way, this is the thing, where understandably you have to talk about the racial politics of the film, you have to talk about the issues that have been raised legitimately about its portrayal of these issues. I think it's very pointed that it is, despite the fact that the character of Mildred is using the violence committed by white police officers against black people, she is not in any way advocating for them. She doesn't care about that violence. She only cares about scoring her points. She uses the N-word herself. She's not particularly invested in the life of Denise, her partner, who works at the store, who is victimized by the police as part of this. Mildred is all invested in her own anger. There's no social justice cause there. There's no righteousness there. She's just hurting herself. It's very clear that it's made very clear and very explicit that there's nothing more the local police department could have done to help solve her daughter's murder. What matters to Mildred is that she's angry at herself to the point where she erects these billboards. Not only, they don't face the town, they don't face the police station. In fact, there are several shots of the cars driving out from the town have to pass the back of the billboards, because that's not who the billboards are directed at. They're directed at the house, which they stand over the field where her daughter died, as a memorial to that, a constant reminder to her of that anger that keeps her going. And again, people have talked about like the idea of the movie redeeming a racist in the character of Jason Dixon, played by Sam Rockwell. This is a movie that ends with himself and Mildred deciding, he half-heartedly tries to be a police officer, relying on the sort of coincidence that you get in lazy stories like this, and it turns out, yes, it is actually a coincidence. He didn't magically solve the case. He isn't actually redeemed, and instead of actually doing the hard work of redeeming himself, he just decides to go for a bit of extrajudicial murder. The closing scene of the film is him and Mildred half-heartedly trying to get better, trying to move past their anger, and instead going and indulging in like murdering this random stranger who, they don't even know has a name. It's this biting, really, really aggressive, really angry story about how rage just seems to fuel and move through. We talked about how anger moves faster on social networks than any other emotion. How Americans, in particular white Americans, who have very little, relatively speaking, to be angry about, are among the angriest people on earth. It really sort of captured that for me. And I understand that it's a polarizing film, it's a divisive film. I completely get that. But for me, no other film this year captured that sense of that sort of like pent up, unconstructive, destructive, like fire being the primary metaphor that the film uses in terms of anger and rage. The fire that consumed Angela and leaves the scorch marks on the ground. The fire that burns down the billboards and leaves them as empty shells that have to be pasted over. The fire that burns the police station and scars Dixon. The idea that the rage that fuels and spreads doesn't actually contribute anything of worth. And I think it's important that that is separate from a lot of what people have tried to connect politically to the film. Stuff like it's not a Black Lives Matters movie because that anger is righteous. It's not a story about police violence because that anger is righteous. It's a story about somebody who is just angry at the world and who can't stop being angry and won't stop being angry. And despite the film's pessimism and cynicism and borderline nihilism, it's interesting that the younger characters, I'm thinking of Red Welby, for example, who forgives Dixon for throwing him out a window. I'm thinking of the son played by Lucas Hedges, who's had a phenomenal year. Lucas Hedges saying that he wants no part in what his mother's doing. I'm thinking even of Penelope, who is a subject of mockery and degradation from the other characters, who observes that anger only begets greater anger. And I found that a very profoundly affecting film.
If I hadn't have seen it, Darren, you might have convinced me to watch it.
I see
know
your
that.
spirit of defense, but I do have to raise you a CGI deer.
Well, don't worry, we'll be coming
I'd
back to that
argue
later in the
that
podcast.
CGI deer is the only authentic moment in that film. It's the only moment where Mildred seems like a human being and not a morally vacuous waste
Yeah.
of a vessel of shit, which is what that film is. I'm so sorry. It is so angry and negative and filled with hate and spite and rage, and it's just so alienating and awful. I cannot understand how anyone could have enjoyed it. And it's one of those horrible films that the further away you get from it, every time you hear the name, you just feel more angry for some reason. You're like, why did somebody make this?
I like
Why
this
did somebody
meta
write
anger.
it? Like, this is, it's infuriating.
I do actually think that's a very valid point. The film, arguably, for me, only increased because it became a vessel for the very anger that it was sort of criticizing. And I mean, a lot of the criticisms are valid. Ira or Madison III's criticism of The Ringer are fantastic reads and very worth engaging with. But I do think that, yeah, it became like, it sort of demonstrated when you couldn't, like La La Land, when you couldn't mention it online without it causing an explosion of itself, was kind of an interesting, like, the film becomes the thing that it is.
Like, I understand what you're saying, Darren, and I think I liked it slightly more than everyone else here except you. But everything that you're saying about the anger at the heart of America and all that is fine if it's coming from somebody that has a strong fundamental understanding of it. And I don't feel that Martin McDonagh does, and I think that that comes across very clearly in the screenplay for this film and the direction of this film. And we've seen similar issues with John Michael in Calvary, with a pontification of the heart of a nation. I'm referring here to Calvary. That
One of the greatest
is,
British films ever made.
Yeah, well, at least we can all
that
agree on
is
this.
ill-informed and fundamentally so. And it's drawing in such big ideas. Like, I'm not going to speak about the racial failings of this film or the problematic aspects of this, and its depiction of responses to sexual violence or anything like that, because I'm not the person to speak about that. But repeatedly in Three Billboards, Martin McDonagh shows the ceiling of his understanding. This is an imprint. This is how he sees America. And when you're trying to say this is how American anger fundamentally is, you have to have a better understanding of America. And that comes across in the overall story, and that comes across in the characters. For me, these characters are so ill-advised and poorly realized, and I don't buy any of them, really, in the end. And the performances in this I found very good, and so coming out of it, I was like, yeah, and there are merits in there, I think. But these characters don't work. They don't. So it's all it all goes nowhere in the end for me. And the films that I have on my list, for example, or a lot of the films that have been mentioned, they all end on very strong notes. This just ends on a fart. I'm sorry, that ending doesn't work for me at all, and it that to me shows its fundamental issues. You've got sitcom level wives, the Abby Cornish character in this. That's like King of Queens levels of this character. Doesn't make any sense in the middle of what you're trying to make. The Peter Dinklage character in this, that's another fundamental problem for me.
I forgot that was a thing.
This is what I
The
think. The more
flashbacks.
you remember about it, the more incensed you become.
There are too many problems in this for me. Like I see some of what you're saying, but the more I thought about this, the less I liked it.
All right, so that may be the contentious pick of the night. Let's move on to our number 4 films, I believe. So, Grace, what is your 4th?
My number 4 is You Were Never Really Here.
I have that higher.
Believe we may have that higher.
I have a number 4 as well.
Play.
Perfect. And so your number...
So, at number 4, I have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Snap!
I had a ball watching this.
Yeah. It's a joy. But we'll wait until we get to me, or do you want to do that?
Well, yeah, he's here, so
Wherever you got it.
I have gone to 4 as well.
Oh, there you go.
So yeah, we'll circle around. So Jay, what about yourself? What's at number 4 for you?
Hang on, did I do number 5?
Did you do number 5?
No.
You did.
Did you not?
How did...
Oh, you're going to talk, Harry?
Oh yes, he is going to talk about that. Okay.
I mean, I did. Yeah, I mean, number 4. It's going to be confusing. Number 4 is you never really hear.
Which
That's
we
what's
are
higher as well.
Are we going to talk about that later?
Yes.
We are going to talk about that later. All right. Apparently we are. So your number 4.
My number 4 was Faces Places.
Oh, now we can talk about it.
Now we can talk about. There we
Shade
go.
in there at number 5. I think it wasn't my first Verda. It was your first Verda, was it, Jay?
Yes, it was.
It was only my second one, and the first time that I really fell deeply, deeply in love. I caught this actually over a year ago at the Fringe Film Festival in the IFI, and it went down really well with the crowd. It's a crowd pleaser without being any of the things that you might imagine based on that description. Having spent a lot of the year since then catching up with a lot of Varda's work, as you poor listeners have heard time in, time
never
out.
ends.
Never, ever, ever tune in next week. I have a much deeper appreciation of what the film is doing, which is drawing on her life's work and experience for this really moving tale of creativity, age. It's really, really beautiful. It comes together really impressively, the way that it functions as this story of sort of artistic mentorship between herself and JR, who gets a co-director credit. It has this idea of aging. She has this sort of rueful perspective on the life she has lived and the life she could have lived, and the advice she is passing on to him. He's largely ignoring it. There's a real tension between these characters, and they are very much characters, because I think the film is playing with fiction and documentary, as Verda has for much of her career. I was really, really moved by it, laughed a lot.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think Darren made a point when he saw it, and he liked it, but I think he had a couple of more issues around it. But I think Ronan kind of hit on something that I was thinking about when you were talking about it, is that having seen, I think, about 9 or 10 more films, what's in this makes more sense, if you know what I mean, than it would have on a first watch, if you know what I mean. And it, even for myself, I liked it a lot more than you did at the time, but it fills in a lot of stuff that goes on. And I think it begins as this kind of life-filled journey, and through kind of memory creation and recreation as well, of kind of putting people up there and back up there. And it does get very melancholic about age and about different things and about kind of paths not taken. And then there's a really remarkable kind of sequence at the end that adds a lot of kind of sadness and oddness to it, which I really, really loved. And they're great double act. And it's one of those things that I loved and savoured every minute I watched. And would have happily spent another couple of hours kind of knocking about with them to various different countries. It's like the trip. I'd want to see them knocking around Germany and then Italy and Spain and stuff like that. I'd happily watch it.
There's your reboot, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So, yeah, I absolutely loved it. And it's one I thought, again, this kind of happened a bit in terms of looking at top 10. I thought it would slip away a little, maybe, because it was initially a little slighter, but the more I've seen of Varda's work, the more I'm impressed by this, which I really like in that regard. In terms of as a filmmaker, a lot of themes that she would have done in 40, 50 years ago is still here. Oh yeah, I like that. Hell of a lot.
There's a really interesting reassessment of her work going on at the moment, and obviously you had that season in the IFI that sort of led us down our long Varda paths. Long may it continue. But you get this...
Varda to go.
You get this all the time with the filmmakers of yore, and you're getting it more now with female filmmakers specifically, and it's fascinating to have Varda alive and working for this, because her work is beginning to comment on it. And I think this film is very much getting into the idea of construction and deconstruction of imagery and iconography. You specifically have blown up images of these ordinary women put up in the shipping containers you get at the end of the film. Yeah. Varda is playing with their imagery, but also her own imagery. She's just been given a Lifetime Achievement Oscar. She is a very big figure in world cinema at this point, and she's sort of toying with that here in this film.
Oh yeah, she's very aware of her own kind of legacy.
Yeah, it's at once a career retrospective and sort of a move into new territory, and at the same time a leg up to a new generation of filmmakers. I think it's working on multiple levels all at once. I adored it.
At Niall's number 4 is American Animals. which I quite liked. I know Ronan didn't like nearly as much.
I was not hot on it.
I didn't like it at all.
I quite liked it. Yeah.
It's one of those great, like, lost idling American youth movies in the style of Fight Club and that sort of stuff. It's the existential crisis of people who have never faced an existential crisis.
And a very effective depiction of that as it exists right now.
Yes.
With stupid boys that face no
I like the
consequences.
For their
I like
actions.
the cast, and
That's true.
The best I can say about it. I really did.
Our Barry.
But yeah, so number 4, myself and Luke's 4th favorite film of the year, Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, really, really good, this one.
Yeah.
Just a really entertaining time at the cinema. And with animated movies, it's sometimes it's possible to kind of breathe past the animation aspect of it.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, the animation in this is
Astounding.
gorgeous.
Sony are attempting to copyright it for variety purposes.
What's it called? Stereoscopic?
Something like that, yeah. But they're using, like, it's got the Ben-Day dots in there, it's got the Kirby cackle, it's got all this wonderful stuff, like the use of red and green to give depth and blur to the background.
Like, it's this combination of that kind of
Rotosculpture,
comic
yeah.
pop art with kind of a Looney Tunes
Sensibility.
physicality to it.
And a Pixar computer-generated quality as well there.
It's and an all-in creation of something new that's really, like, it's fun to watch and it's beautiful as well. Like, it's a great looking film.
It is. I mean, like, the characters look like they're inked. You don't want to talk about the comic book design. Like, you can see that there are, like, inking lines on, like, their noses and their hands and stuff. It's astounding. It's absolutely beautiful to look at.
And very accessible. Like, this is a love letter to Spider-Man that pretty much anyone could get into, and it's not, it's not navel-gazy or kind of masturbatory in that way. It's actually very encouraging and very welcoming in the sense that it's giving you new characters to enjoy and new perspectives to enjoy. You've got Miles Morales, who's a more diverse hero. You've got Gwen Stacy
as Spider-Woman, who is obviously a female Spider-Man. Like, the entire point of the movie is that anyone can wear the mask, which is a remarkable thing. And, like, you talked about 2017, Marvel had this big crisis in comic book publishing, and it got massive coverage. I think Donald Clark covered it in the Irish Times, the New York Times covered it, the Atlantic covered it, where retailers were saying, well, these women and, black people and gay people aren't selling as well in comic books. And, first of all, if you actually break down the figures, that's not true. But because you don't have journalists who actually understand how comic books work, nobody pointed that out and just accepted it at face value. But the issue is that you have those now entering the mainstream. Like, you have a generation of people for whom their Spider-Man will be an African-American Latino Spider-Man. It would be like, for kids, it will be looking at Miles Morales. That's astounding and staggering and beautiful.
And the thing is, this understands and grows from the fundamental appeal of Spider-Man going back to the 1960s.
Yeah.
And it's very aware of that, but it does that in a really great way. Like, Marvel, is the juggernaut behind major cinema at the moment.
Yeah.
And that all stems from
Spider-Man
in
and
the 1960s.
the Fantastic Four, yeah.
And it captures that same appeal and it makes it more accessible. It's really, really good.
And I mean, we talked about brushing past the animation. The animation's outstanding, but the script is astounding. It is one of the best scripts of this year. It is a staggering piece of work because it assumes audience literacy. It's a film that one of the rare blockbuster films that doesn't underestimate its audience, attention span, but also intelligence. It's a film that's predicated on the idea that the audience watching this understands how the mechanics of these stories work. To the point where, like, the villain's motivation, Kingpin Wilson Fisk's motivation, is not provided via expository dialogue or a really painful first act setup. It's a 15 to 30 second flashback in visual that fills in the gaps in what an audience knows is going to be a tragic villain backstory.
Yeah.
It does this thing repeatedly where it comes back to the Spider-Man origin, which audiences have sat through at least 3 times in the past 20 years and makes a joke of it. It's like, let's do this one last time. It's like spider bite, web costume, slinging, heroes, responsibility, that sort of stuff. It's very playful and very self-aware. It's that technique that you're sort of seeing where you're seeing a lot of stuff from television, because you've had this discussion where people are talking about how, like, television's starting to look like film. Yeah. You're getting, like, film starting to look like television. Like Infinity War is very much Game of Thrones. It's narrative model. The engine that drives Infinity War is Game of Thrones. You take a vast ring of characters and a vast number of plot lines and jump between them geographically based on theme. That's the narrative engine of Game of Thrones. This is something more like narrative, like acceleration-y. It's the idea that you can do... The audience knows the rhythm of these stories, so you can tell 6 Spider-Man origins in the space of 2 hours without it ever getting boring, because the audience knows enough to fill in the gaps along the way. It's staggering.
And, this is it's a hilarious script, but it's not just well written in that way. You've got several different Spider-Mans here.
Spider-Man-I.
But they all exist as a reflection of
the same core
Miles
idea.
Morales and different things that he's struggling with through his character arc in different ways. You've got Peter B. Parker, who's this kind of schlubby
Jake Johnson-esque character.
Spider-Man. That reflects,
the anxiety,
Miles' fear of failure.
Yeah.
You've got Spider-Gwen, who's his contemporary in
At
age,
school,
but is much more assured and accomplished than he is. You've got Spider-Ham, who's literally a joke, which again reflects his anxieties.
John Mulaney, which is great.
You've got
Spider-Man Noir.
Spider-Man Noir, the best Nick Cage performance of the year.
Oh.
Who brings his own rain and wind with him no matter where he is, even when he's indoors.
But he reflects Miles's feelings of inadequacy about his physical prowess. And then you've got Penny Parker, which is Kimiko Glenn from Orange is the New Black, who is this anime genius character.
Big eyes, 2-dimensional animation.
With a spider robot that reflects his insecurities about his intelligence. Yeah. And they all work on their own level. Some of them have more arcs than others, but they also work as a reflection of him as the main character. It's really great work. Yeah.
It is it's a fantastic accomplishment. And if we are going to live in a superhero boom, I want more superhero movies that look like this.
Everything that superhero movies do well, this does.
And more.
I will be hopefully watching it over Christmas. I do want to catch it, so you've sold me completely.
All right, so let's move on to our top 3. Grace, what is your number 3?
My number 3 is A Quiet Place. Is that on anyone else's list?
Nope.
Okay, well, I loved A Quiet Place. I feel like it's been a bit divisive among certain people on the podcast.
Yes.
All of whom will remain unnamed. But no,
It's Ronan and Jay.
I really like
divisive.
this. This is one of those films that I went in expecting next to nothing and just was really blown away by how good it was. And especially considering it's relatively, it's pretty early in John Krasinski's directing career, for him to make something this assured and so, to my mind, distinctive and well realized is really quite a coup. But I just love the story in A Quiet Place. I like the way there's so much focus. Even though this is a film that's a horror movie, and very clearly a horror movie, and has lots of very unnerving, if not outright frightening things in it, not least the incident that happens in the opening scenes. This is also something that focuses so heavily on loss and family dynamics and grief and trauma and, a family struggling to come to terms with that, and especially in a world where they can't easily communicate because of the monsters around them using sound to hunt. I just think is so... It just makes for a really interesting premise and really interesting ways of interacting and exploring a family dynamic. And it's also a film that features a character that has a disability and incorporates that very explicitly into the narrative, and I think does that very well. All of the family feel very much like real people and very people that you can empathize with, and I don't know, I just really was very surprised by how much I loved it, but I think it's a very, very good film.
It's one of the remarkable recent sort of trend of movies that are literalizing the cinematic horror movie watching experience, where you have movies that literalize the act of an audience watching the movie. I think that Lights Out, for example, which is one where the creature can only move when you can't see it, which is that great horror movie, don't look away from the screen sensation. You have stuff like Bird Box later on this year. It's on Netflix this weekend, I believe, which is where if you look at the creature, it will drive you insane. So you've got that reverse impulse of looking at it. But this is one where if you're in a cinema watching a horror movie, and I've been in the cinema watching this a couple of times, the audience is deathly quiet. Yeah. It becomes an audience participation event where the audience...
That's why we love it so much. It finally got everyone to shut up.
But it is it's almost as if the audience are complicit in it. It's one of those things that's really great about, again, we talked about spectacle-driven cinema, stuff like Bohemian Rhapsody and stuff like Mary Poppins Returns, and this idea. This is something that hinges on the cinematic experience of watching a horror movie. It's remarkable in that respect, and I really, really love that about it.
Yeah, and it would die on its arse if it didn't do that well. Like
Yeah.
if it didn't make audiences be quiet, it wouldn't work. But Krasinski manages to do that. It's the best self-involved beardy white man directorial and acting performance of the year.
I wonder who you could possibly be casting shade at, Luke.
Stole my voice.
You didn't. You weren't using it to.
Alien stole my voice.
You weren't fucking saying anything.
Star is Born's good too.
So, at number 3, Luke, is it A Star is Born?
No, it's Lady Bird, so I know we'll be talking about that
I
later.
suspect we will be
It might come
talking.
up.
It might possibly come up. So, what is at number 3 for you, Jay?
At number 3 is Dogman.
That's going to come up.
That's going to come up again. All right, so what is at number 3 for you, Ronan?
At number 3, I have got La Casa Loba, The Wolf House, Chilean film. You're talking with Into the Spider-Verse about sort of incredible animation, doing something new with a story. This, for me, was the most visually inventive film of the year. I knew nothing about it. It premiered in Berlin this year and had a limited run on Mubi. Went in knowing absolutely nothing about it, and it floored me. It's something like 70 minutes long, and it must have taken years and years to do, because it has this extraordinary 3D, 2D animation style where you have a camera panning around a model house, which is animated by stop motion, but also there are 2D cartoons unfolding on the walls and floor of the house, moving parts all over the place. It's bizarre. Gets deep into an idea of national identity and trauma on a family and wider national level. It's really, really frightening. You know the scary toys in Toy Story in Andy's neighbor's room?
Yes.
The effect they had on me as a kid, and I was about 4 when Toy Story came out. It reminded me of that instantly, that same level of deep terror. It's so frightening and so effective for it. Really worth checking
Seeking out if you can find it.
If you can find it.
I almost did on Movie, and then I went, and then
I did.
here we are.
Yeah. At number 3 for Niall is Leave No Trace.
Yeah, this
Lovely film.
I liked it a lot, and it's kind of around the 20-ish mark
It's
for
in
me.
my teens, I think.
It didn't quite work as well as it should have. Everything about it I really liked, but it didn't quite overall kind of break any higher. It's something I'd probably rewatch again.
I
though.
really liked it. I like the gentleness of it. Is probably what I most
Yeah,
loved about
I can
it.
see that.
It's the idea of a wilderness story, but it's a wilderness story where people are generally trying to understand and be pleasant to one another as much as it is physically possible for them to be. Which I found really nice. After, like, Winter's Bone is an exhausting film emotionally. Leave No Trace deals with some really heavy themes, but I found it actually reassuring.
I know exactly where I come from, and it's one I think a rewatch will work really well for, I have to say.
So, remember when I said 3 Billboards was going to be my divisive pick?
Oh, Jesus.
At number 3 for me, it's First Man.
I like First Man.
Thank you.
Aye.
There's one. But yeah, First Man I really, really adored. First Man is fascinating because it's one of those great divisive films where are there too many flags in it? Are there not enough flags in it? Are there just the right amount of flags in it? And how do you measure a movie's worth in those terms? It's a brilliantly divisive film, but it's an interesting film because, and I think the reason why it is so divisive is because it's picking at this idea of an American national myth at a time when America's going through a sense of existential crisis, where the space race existed at the height of the Cold War. It was the big symbolic victory. It was a defining moment for America in terms of culture, in terms of iconography. The Cold War as a symbolic struggle, this was the crowning accomplishment. Going up, planting a flag, and that was the extent of the new frontier. That was the limit of, like, mankind and America's capacity to reach at that moment in time. And then coming back to it now and trying to recontextualize it in an era where America is no longer, like, the moral leader of the world, let alone the economic leader of the world, where it's looking at its place constantly shifting, where, you know, everything has changed fundamentally and socially. I understand why the film hits the nerves that it does. And what I think it does that is very, very interesting is it finds a way to tell this mythology, this idea of a nationalist mythology, in a way that is profoundly personal and intimate. It finds a way to turn this from a story about a nation doing something patriotic and heroic and, being honest, jingoistic, and turns it into a character study about an individual. It doesn't say, we went to the moon with an exclamation mark. It says, why would this one man choose to go to the moon? As an aspect of singular purpose. It is visceral, it is intimate, it is deeply, deeply personal. And it feels at times almost spiritual in nature. There's a phenomenal central performance, I know that everybody's going to disagree with this, from Gosling, where he emotes so perfectly with his eyes. There's that visceral quality of watching the ship almost shake apart, the floorboards shining red with heat as it comes in to re-enter during the opening sequence. The cramped claustrophobic sensation of being locked inside this object with nothing but tinfoil between you and a vast, empty, uncaring cosmos. The idea of landing on a moon and standing on an empty, dead rock where it's nothing but you and whatever you have brought there with you, literally and metaphorically. I found it deeply moving. People have talked about the film where they came closest to crying here. This got me pretty close. Didn't actually get me there, but no movie got me there this year. But this movie got me really close, and it wasn't any of the space scenes. It was a quiet scene in which Gosling's Neil Armstrong tries to have a conversation with Josh Clark's character, and can't. He can't make that difference. He can't make that distance. He can throw himself up into space. He can do these impossible things. He can risk his own life, but he can't get past that tiny, insignificant personal barrier. That closing shot, you talk about great endings, that closing shot of himself and his wife, who will divorce a decade or so after the end of the film, separated by glass even after he's come back to Earth.
I like that
It's
ending.
beautiful. It's astonishingly and deeply moving.
And like sad as well.
Yes,
you
no,
know,
yeah.
And kind of sad.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it is the story of Armstrong, but it presents him as a pitiable character. It's a deeply, you feel sorry for him. You don't feel proud of him.
I'm with you, Darren. Don't worry.
It's both, for me, Chazelle's best film and the 59th best film this year.
Thank you, Jay.
Of the 59 that you watched.
Of the 82 that it was.
I know Chazelle's not everybody's favorite, but
He's
considering
serious,
what
though.
he's come off the back of, you got to give him that he's taken what could be another big kind of crowd-pleasing, attempting film, and gone insular with it, and taken this, American myth of a man and decided to look inwardly rather than at his accomplishments. And, the easy response to that is that when he looks inwardly, there's not that much there. But I think Giselle pushes, and the screenwriter as well pushes that further and asks, well, why is there nothing there?
Yeah.
And again, it's easy to criticize Gosling's performance because, as he can
He
tend to
underplays
be,
it.
he's quite blank.
Yeah.
I think he works with the character.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think it's a very good very. But that's coming from. I think that's attempting to come from the person. This is an adaptation of a biography of Armstrong, who is a difficult man to
Get a read on.
Yeah, and I think it does that quite effectively, both with Armstrong himself and with some wider ideas out of that. I would have had this higher up, but there's, for me, just a bit too many biography bits floating around that drag this down. The way that this deals with Claire Foy's character, for me, is
There's one woman and she's concerned, which is a legitimate criticism.
yeah. If what you're doing with Armstrong is that he's this emotionally distant person, then don't bother.
Yeah.
If you're not actually going to use someone as talented as Claire Foy in a real part and not this
We do live in a
best
universe.
supporting actress kind of ready kit made thing, don't bother. Have her as a more minor character. Cast
This isn't even the movie that most wastes Claire Foy this autumn. Let's be honest here.
True, but that for me is a big problem. Also, the thing on the moon with the
Oh, jeez.
Are you bringing anything with you except your emotional baggage, Mr. Armstrong?
dumb, clunky screenplay moment. It's silly.
Awful.
It's not good.
It's pretty bad.
All right, so let's move on to our top two. Grace, what is your second favorite film of the year?
My second favorite film of the year is Set It Up, which is
Ooh.
a joy and a wonder of a film, and one that I'm so grateful exists in this hellfire landscape that we have to walk through every bloody day. So, to go back to something that Luke was saying earlier about rom-coms and the way they sort of fell out of favor for a whole bunch of reasons, I found Set It Up incredibly refreshing. because it's something that feels very traditional and doesn't really attempt to step outside of the mold very much, which for a lot of films could be a death knell in this day and age, but there's something about this that just works so well. I think the writing is so snappy, and the characters, more than anything, are so likable, and they're so engaging that you just love spending time with them. And I really just enjoyed watching them talk to each other and talk about their situation and make endless quips, and it's just a delight. There's just so much joy in this film, and no kind of cynicism and no darkness and no kind of grim real life consequences. You know, anything that sort of happened to them that could be perceived as negative is very much just a part of life and something that's very recognizably a part of life, but it still approaches it in a very upbeat, naturalistic way, and I just think that that's what makes this so striking. And it's the film I've rewatched most this year, and I haven't rewatched a lot, but I've watched this several times, and it never failed to put a smile on my face.
It's pretty great, I have to say. It's hovering around the 20 mark for me at the moment of the year, but as I said, it's been a pretty good year. I like this a lot. All the characters are kind of well developed and really sparkling script. Adds so much to it. Like
the acting is amazing.
And
Like,
I haven't watched it again, but I'll probably watch it over Christmas. It feels like a Christmas afternoon, glass of red wine on the couch kind of movie, and I'm already looking forward to it. And I imagine it's going to become a staple, quite frankly.
You could watch that film 10, 15
really
times
can,
and enjoy it as much every time, if not more.
There are very few people whose screen presence I've enjoyed as much this year as Zoe Deutsch.
She's
great.
She's
magnetic.
Yeah, she's marvelous in it.
And you know, when other genres have that kind of fall out of favor, they go back to the drawing board and they go big and drop big things. This is a romantic comedy that would work in any decade.
Yeah, I agree.
You could go back as far as the 30s and this would work.
Yeah.
But
it's well aware
because
it's smart in that way.
It's doing those same things just from a different perspective and doing them all really well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Luke, you're number 2.
My number 2 is Phantom Thread.
Let's talk about Phantom Thread then.
I could have forgot about that. I thought they were way back.
And that was your number 9 there, yeah.
Phantom Thread, again, this looks like a certain kind of film at first glance, and it very much is that, but it's also much more, as it is with the literal goings on in the plot. There are things woven in here that you don't find when you first glance at it. This is a unexpectedly hilarious film. I've seen this a couple times, and the amount of times that you're finding, I found myself laughing out loud were very surprising for a Paul Thomas Anderson.
Well, he has a knack for comedy that's massively underrated.
He does, yeah.
Punch-Drunk Love is, like, I would argue, a massively underrated Anderson film.
It's his best film.
Ooh, come out of the internet,
there.
And it wasn't just the air conditioning.
Hey.
I've got the master. There, but,
we appreciate your effort.
Thanks, Rob.
But and again, like I was talking about how being memeable worked.
This film has taken off. All right.
What's that out of context?
My favorite Twitter of the favorite new Twitter of the year is Phantom Thread out of context.
Yeah.
I've been able to use it in so many ways. But that what that speaks to is that these characters might seem oblique or inaccessible at first glance, but they're very richly realized because of the performances and because of the writing. And like this is they're screening at New Year's, aren't they, at the Lighthouse?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, so there is, yeah.
It's got a real New Year's Eve vibe
It
to
does,
it.
it does,
you know?
actually. I'd kind of largely echo what Luke says. There's a real Powell and Pressburger vibe off it, particularly the first hour or so of it, which I really got. And that suggests to me that Anderson really put the shift in research-wise in terms of what he was attempting here and what he was going for. But with Luke, in terms, it's really funny. I mean, breakfast situations are seen like things I've never seen before or since. The remarkable power plays at breakfast are just, and the looks and the sound and
it's easy to chalk that up to, this is a great Daniel Day-Lewis performance, and obviously he's the one that carries a lot of the plaudits for this film, but that's down to so many aspects of filming. That's down to sound design. That's down to that's non-showy cinematography. Really, really great work.
There's great roles. I mean, whatever with Day-Lewis, and Lewis is doing what Day-Lewis does, and he's very enjoyable, very funny, and whatever. Manville and Vicky Krieps are fantastic. Like, and as a trio, they're just phenomenal. Like together.
It's really interesting to me what this film does around the idea of the great man, the great artist, which is what Deleuze is playing. Deleuze himself is sort of held up as, and Anderson indeed has. Many of his fans are terrible people.
Yeah,
you know, they're the Anderson film bros, kind of thing.
Kill me.
And I think Anderson is self-aware enough that he's really playing around with this kind of idea. The idea of, the great genius who's actually just a petty little horrible man.
Yeah, it is. He's a man-child. He's a cultured man-child.
Yeah,
is essentially what he is.
And it's very funny.
And I'm glad Anderson could do that, because I'd start to dislike him if he couldn't, if he wasn't at least aware of
other
that.
directors have done this and it's not worked.
Yeah,
I would say in recent times. Yeah. Not throwing any names out there. Mother.
Yes, indeed, I would agree with that.
So,
God.
Jay, number 2.
Oh, hang on, let's switch back. Number 2 is The Image You've Missed.
Also on Ronan.
Which you can probably take from here.
The Image You Shouldn't Miss, based on the reviews it's getting here.
Yes, indeed. This is Donald Foreman's documentary. It's really interesting. He's made a film about kind of talking about the legacy of his estranged father, who was a documentarian, Arthur McCaig, and who made documentaries and stuff during the conflict in Northern Ireland back in the day. And Foreman, if anybody's seen his previous one, Out of Here, which is really, really good.
Not enough people have seen it.
Not enough people have seen it. He's one of Ireland's, potentially one of Ireland's best filmmakers. And this cements that, I would suggest. He looks at this film and looks at his father's films and his father in many ways, and gets at the separation, the loss, and the things they have in common, like how well they can edit, and how the editing brings them together in a way that life couldn't do it, how a film can bring you together in the way that life necessarily can't do for everyone. And the kind of way he looks for links, like in a political way, in a personal way, in the way they travel, in the way they live. It's just wonderful. It's so beautifully edited. I mean, except for my film at number 1, it's probably the best edited film I've seen this year. And that's what we maybe have in common in that regard. But I absolutely adored this. I couldn't get enough of it. And Foreman's a major talent.
Yeah, I really couldn't get enough of it either. It's one of my most rewatched films of the year. I think I saw it 3 times, twice them on the big screen. It's just absolutely fascinating the way it gets into and under the skin of the Troubles, which in a way are a sideshow to everything that's going on in the film, which is remarkable. It covers 2 things in extraordinary depth.
Way of getting at it.
Yeah, and one thing I absolutely adore about this is one of the opening title cards, which is a film between Donald Foreman and Arthur McCaig, because it very much is. It's and you talk about how it's brilliantly edited, and it is kind of the essence of cinema is the editing that you don't get in any other art form, and it understands this perfectly and creates in the contrast between 2 styles a dialogue between them. It's absolutely beautiful.
And it's like one of those things that has a central theme and a clear idea of what he wants to do, but yet he's open enough to understand that his father's films and his father's life informs his film as much as he does. And that's really smart. It's really perceptive in terms of his own life. I think goodness knows what he's going to do going forward, but he's you should see Out of Here, and you should see this. He's just a great filmmaker.
There's an extraordinary sense of discovery at the heart of the film, and it has that great tone where you feel like he doesn't quite know what he's going to discover, and you're along on that journey with him. But it's so well controlled.
Yeah,
it really took me by surprise.
All right, and your number 2, Ronan?
My number 2 of this year
is BPM.
Why do you know my list better than I do?
You put it on Letterboxd and made it public.
Did you just put it in beforehand?
I put it in the spreadsheet beforehand to make my maths much easier. This is my mystery ruin now.
I only updated that at like 2 p.m. today. I hope you got the right version.
I'd hope if I told you the wrong film, you would realize
that's true. My number 2 is variously released in different parts of the world, 120 BPM. Which is the French film looking at the work of Acte Paris in the 90s. It's the 90s, isn't it?
I think it's very late 90s, very late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. And talking, as we were earlier, about Bohemian Rhapsody and how that is playing to an extraordinarily large audience, and sort of perpetuating these long-held images in mass media of gay characters and their seedy underworlds and how that's all horrible and terrible. BPM is a really bold reclamation of that kind of thing. It sort of wrests control of the narrative back, and it does that in a remarkable way. I've talked a lot on the podcast in the last couple of months about the idea of tragic queer narratives. 120 BPM really goes headfirst into the most tragic queer narrative of all, which is the AIDS crisis. And in looking at AIDS activists and really not recoiling from the most horrible horrors of that crisis, it finds joy, it finds love, it finds beauty, it finds warmth, it finds a great deal of humour. I was floored by it the first time I saw it. The second time I saw it at an actual ACT UP benefit with a very, very packed crowd, and it's the most crying I've ever heard in one room. But it is not relentlessly tragic in any kind of way. It is absolutely tragic, and there are a great many tragic things that happen in the film. But it uses the power of that tragedy to learn from history, and I think, crucially, comparing it to the likes of Bohemian Rhapsody, to take images back in a way that cinema has struggled to over the last number of decades. It really reminded me of a really great Andrew Howler novel called Dancer from the Dance. And it's much easier to do this kind of thing in literature, to, create a distinct queer literature, because it's a much smaller audience and you don't need to deal with audience concerns quite as much. 120 BPM, with many other films in the last couple of years, feels like something that's doing that for cinema. And it really, really struck me.
I saw this during the week, and it didn't make my top 10, but it's in my top 20. It's really, really interesting. It's really sensual, really political, and so much dark humour in it. But it's crucially, in terms of we're talking about Bohemian Rhapsody and the kind of sexist element to it, other than the seediness of being gay, this is extremely sexual in the way that bloody well should be, in terms of like showing what people do. Music is urgent, everything about it pulsates in that way, but life, while still the spectre of kind of the AIDS crisis hangs around it.
Literally intercut with all these dance disco scenes.
And it's an amazing dance disco scene that kind of almost drifts up to the heavens, and then it almost dissolves into molecules, which is also into cells, which is into the kind of body kind of horror that is the AIDS clinic. I loved it. The finale is wrenching. The music is great, and it does this wonderful thing of linking France's really proud history of strikes and protests, and that this is absolutely counts as one of these. It's not just a separate thing because this is about AIDS or this is about queer narratives. This is like central to how France thinks. Like, you can protest and you can call out politicians, and as it should be, as it's always baked into right there. They'll do it on everything, and this is another celebrated form of it. And I really like that kind of connecting to history and reclaiming their place in history in that regard, in the right protest, and I really, really liked it.
Yeah, I was really impressed by the emotional dichotomy of it, that you have this absolute tragedy. It was heart-wrenching, and it really, a gut punch of a film, I thought. And yet I walked out sort of triumphant and jubilant in a strange way.
I can actually see that, because the characters, like, burn life.
Yeah.
Niall's number 2 is Katie. We talked about it being a strong year for Irish documentary. In fact, we've already discussed a couple. But yeah, Katie is his number 2.
I didn't catch up on it, unfortunately. We'll hopefully over Christmas.
I have not seen it either. Has anyone here seen it?
No, unfortunately not. No.
God damn it.
No one can speak to it.
State of us.
It's been a busy year.
It has been a very
to
busy...
find a new apartment.
fair
Listeners, if you can help Luke out.
No, that's done.
Oh, good man.
Happy ending.
Okay. And my number 2 is I, Tonya. Which I adored. Yes, there we go. Another surprise entry. Hopefully a bit less contentious. But very much the biopic for the post-truth era, which I kind of adored about it. The idea of playing with the idea of truth and what truth is, and how these narratives get constructed and how they relate to reality and who controls these and who's in service of them. I absolutely adored. It's incredibly playful. It's darkly, darkly funny, but in a way that condemns the audience for their participation in it, which I also really, really like. There's a moment in it where the music stops and the camera focuses on Margot Robbie in her home playing Tonya Harding, saying, "You all abused me too." And it's very much an accusation the camera is framing at the audience. It's our complicity in what we do, this sort of stuff. And I mean, it's not even just the exploitation in terms of reality TV or documentaries or stuff like that. It's also the stuff that we talked about with Bohemian Rhapsody, where you're taking somebody's life and warping it to suit a narrative that either suits you as a filmmaker or suits society as a whole to hear. It's a fascinating piece of film because it's based around a set of unreliable narrators who are all servicing their own agenda, who are frequently telling the camera that these things didn't happen as you're watching them happen on screen. It's back and forth. It seems to resonate with me in the moment that we're in at the moment, where everything is completely off the wall. The post-truth era, post-reality, post-consensus reality era that we're in. And it just, it just really popped to me in the same way that something like The Tale did, where you have the fictionalization of a true story in order to help work through it. Here you have the idea of fictionalizing a biopic in order to explore like what a biopic actually is and what it means and what purpose it serves and who it serves in particular. I adored this. I found it fascinating. I watched it a couple of times now, and it pops every single time for me.
I would just like to thank this film for giving us Jay's immortal 3-word phrase, "Sweary Deirdre Barlow." That's what I'd like to
Got
think.
such mileage out of that one.
I thought it was okay. I liked the performances more than I liked the film.
Yeah.
But
agree.
there's certainly plenty to admire in it, but it still felt kind of generic, even when it was throwing off the generic kind of thing. And it's hard to get away with both, but they tried. I'll give it that.
I really don't like I, Tanya.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't expect that we would disagree that
So much. I was so happy when we landed on Into the Spider-Verse.
We got a good place there in the middle.
Yeah, and then we branched very widely.
And Mission Impossible too.
Yeah.
But I, Tanya is kind of playing around with false narratives and kind of media complicitness in breaking down and building up of individuals. All that would be great if this film was coming from a place of genuine regard or respect for Tanya Harding, and I really don't think that it is. And that comes through in its portrayal of her. I think even as it is kind of dealing from different perspectives, and it itself is a form of media that's commenting on Tanya Harding, and it knows that. It's making a joke out of her a little too often, to really have for me to fully buy in to that endpoint. It also loses Tanya Harding's narrative for a long stretch in the middle of the film, in the service of more. At some point, I feel like somebody realized that again that there were awards in These Here Hills, and that they were in and Best Supporting Actress, and that's a great performance, but you're losing Tanya there. You're also losing her in this kind of dopey
Coen Brothers-esque sort of segment. With
with Sebastian Stan, and the issue there is that I don't know if this is a screenwriting issue, or I don't really know where to put this, but the defining moment in Tanya Harding's public narrative is something that she wasn't present for.
Yes.
Which is that's a challenge for a screenplay. Yeah. That's quite a big challenge, and I don't know that this necessarily pulled that off.
I would argue that losing her in the center of it is very much the point of it. Losing her in that moment, because it's not her narrative. She has no control over it, even though it's been placed in her lap, even though she's been playing for it. I mean, even the editing of that sequence, even as you have the characters saying, that whether or not she knew or was complicit, the editing of that sequence seems to suggest that there was minimal complicity on her part and maximum on the part of Jet. It's very much, I think that's part of the point of the film, is that she had very little control over what she was doing, and so got lost in that story.
But not to get too much into the real life person here, but I think that she did have a degree of control. So I don't know. There are directions that this maybe could have gone in or didn't. I think there are some very good performances in it. I think that there are some very strange musical choices in it. I don't really understand why it's making the musical choices that it is, and what that's in service of.
I'm pretty sure I'll never bother watching again.
Yeah.
We'll see it once, and it's like, even if you like that, I couldn't ever see myself finding anything else.
It's kind of a triumph of style over substance, I think. Like, it's interesting, and there are things in it that I really like, but it does not coalesce in a way that earns the sort of wacky, abrasive style it's going for. It just doesn't.
It reminded me of The Big Short, but I think I like The Big Short more than this. In terms of that, it's this kind of big bombastic mediation on media, but I don't think it pulls off a lot of what it's going for. The Sufjan Stevens song about Tanya Harding is a much more tender and genuine depiction of her story.
And so we come to number one.
And here we go.
Numero uno. The podcast's favorite movies of the year in question. So, Grace, what is your favorite movie of 2018?
To the surprise of no one, my favorite movie this year was Lady Bird.
Snap.
Okay, let's talk about it now then.
Yeah, sure, why not? Go ahead, Grace.
Lady Bird is a masterpiece. It is a beautiful, beautiful film that just cements Greta Gerwig's place as one of the great voices of our generation. And I'm so glad I live in the timeline where Greta Gerwig is writing and directing films like this. Like, this story is just a revelation, and it's a revelation because it's something that takes something that is not particularly original or new. It's a coming-of-age story featuring all sorts of things that we've seen so many times before: conflict with parents, conflict with family, trying to figure out, your path in life, exploring romance and sex and everything else. But it just tells it in such a fresh, distinctive way, and in a way that really positions a female character and a young female character in an age group where so many girls are just completely written off and nobody takes them seriously, and no one positions their struggles or their experiences as having any relevance or any significance in the wider world. And it just puts her completely at the center of it and makes everything else in the film secondary to her. And even more importantly, it used the only real relationship that it explores in any depth is her relationship with her mother, and the way her mother is such a formative influence, and the way that they fight, and how similar they are but also how different they are, and how the dynamic plays out is just so recognizable and so real and rooted in such a real understanding of human nature and the dynamics that form mother-daughter relationships. And this stands out so much to me because we've seen, I don't know how many films about fathers and sons and all that kind of patriarchal stuff, but you don't see a relationship dynamic between mothers and daughters explored as often, and this film does it incredibly well. In the same way that, say, something like Steel Magnolias did it very well, where the relationship is so often fraught and like they tend to fight more often than they do anything else, and yet it comes from a place of such deep love. And the way that I think Greta tells that story, and the performances too, are so important, and Saoirse Ronan and Laurie Metcalf are outstanding. The way that they're able to play off each other and eventually bring the story to a place where they are literally and figuratively mirrored, and in that they finally come to understand each other's place in their lives. And it's such a graceful story. It's so light as well, because I feel like sometimes if you go into that description of it, it sounds really heavy and kind of preachy and judgy, and it's not. Like, it's just so breathy and carefree, and really mirrors, I think, the perspective of its lead in that regard. Like, she's just at that age of life where everything is so, like, it's a very big deal, but at the same time everything just sort of flies by because you're not getting too wrapped up in everything for long enough. And it's just a delight. I love this film so much.
I'd agree. I've talked about it enough times on the podcast at this stage. I've seen it 3 times this year, and it gets better and better in each watch. It's probably the best edited film I've seen this century, quite frankly, I think. And it passes by almost unnoticed because it's not calling attention to itself at every turn, which is generally what gets edited in Oscars a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. It is so gracefully and beautifully edited that it makes me swoon watching it. It's so well done. And Gerwig has almost a veteran's understanding of her characters and what they're doing and why they're doing it and where they stand in relation to everyone else. It's just outstanding. Like, I've said everything I need to kind of say about it before, but like, it's not it's by some distance the best one this year. Like clear best, and one of the best films this decade.
Mm-hmm.
I will politely disagree with that, but with more politeness that has been shown.
I didn't say I did not say a word about any of the films you said. That was it. I let it to everybody else this time.
It's magnificent, and the things that Gerwig does, that fully realized perspective of the characters. She never lets any of the characters in this film off the hook. Nobody is, you don't come to realize actually Laurie Metcalf was right all along. It's not that kind of thing, It's more rounded than that, and that work on the characters, and that work in the direction. This is a very, very well directed, but not at all showy film. Those are the things that make the difference. That's what puts this ahead of several other films, that have been that are really good, or other films this year that have been really enjoyable. But this just has that little bit more than a lot of them in those regards. And like, Gerwig as a writer is, she's written other films, but there's so much consideration put into every aspect of this, both within the characters and within the themes and within incidental details, and that all comes out really well, I think.
And it's one of those films, I think, and this is quite rare, and I think that's probably what elevates it above for me too, is that you understand it fundamentally. You see completely her point of view and her perspective come across, and the empathy and the understanding that she has for her characters, because there's a lot of films that, are celebrated as great, and even films I really like, where you look at them and you just you feel like you're regarding something, like something that's up in a pedestal. But Lady Bird feels like a world that you were actively invited into and enriched by, and you're just completely drowned in all of the details, right down to the way you have these little seemingly throwaway scenes with, like, the teacher talking to her mother about how he feels really kind of alone and like there's no one he can talk to, and these aren't dwelled upon, but they're these really important background elements of the world that just help you to...
Oh, it enriches it.
Yeah,
it adds so much. I completely agree.
And that's just something that you don't get very often in film.
And you're exactly right that there's that focus on these two women, the relationship between them, but there's such depth of understanding in Gerwig's writing and direction that all the characters, no matter how peripheral, really bring something into it and feel completely lived in and it's half comical, but the depth of compassion that the priest is treated with, there's that, I cried and laughed at many points in this film. I did it all at once, and that scene of him, seeing who couldn't cry last, it's just so funny and sad. It works so well. It's filled with these characters that, even if they don't get much screen time, they really feel fleshed out. Lovely little moments from Tracy Letts sort of half smiling, half looking at the floor as he sees his son go for the same job that he's going for. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary little moments that just fill in the world. And I think you're exactly right. You feel like you can live in there. And I enjoyed living there.
All right, so Luke, your number one pick.
And if you want to go at me for this one, that's fine. It's Venom. No.
That'd be amazing.
You Were Never Really Here is my number one.
And a bingo for the Scannain podcast. I appeared in all 6 of the top 10s, which is quite impressive.
Wow. Yes,
it is Niall's number one as well.
Nice.
But would you like to speak for him in absentia?
This is a film. I don't think there's any other film that I've kind of kicked around in my head. And I did only see it the once, but this is the film that I've come back to the most, which is what pushed it up to number one. Again, some very strong competition. This is a film that opens in darkness. The first voice that you hear is somebody that you can't see and you don't know who they are, and it's counting down and you don't really understand what's happening. Counting. And that feels disconnected. And then you realize why that's happening and you feel horrified. And from there's a real kind of, even from the title, there's a real mediation on presence and absence, through the, and how that's kind of caused through grief and particularly through violence. That it's just so well realized for me. Violence, because it is so prominent, in our world, is very important in a lot of the films that I'm drawn to, and I find increasingly, even in whether it's a stupid action movie or a film like this that's more thoughtful and considered, its perspective on violence is very important to me in how much I value it. And Lim Ramsey, she views violence with, like, it's easy to deconstruct the action thriller with kind of contempt or with subversion, but she approaches it with kind of a pity that is really really powerful to me, because there is no contempt in that pity. I don't feel there is only kind of a sadness that it has to be this way, and a hopefulness that actually it doesn't have to be this way. That first voice that you hear is from somebody that's had horrible things happen to them, but the place that they end up at the end is a lot more hopeful than you might think going into this film, or even as you're going through it. And I think what pushed this ahead of me from Phantom Thread into number one is that, like I say, The Master is my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson film, but this is my favorite Joaquin Phoenix performance. Joe is a broken person, kind of fundamentally, because of the violence that he's experienced throughout every aspect of his life, both physically and emotionally. He's been subjected to emotional violence from the abuse of his father, from the fundamental abusive nature of the work that he's done in the military, and in the world that he's chosen to enter in his adulthood, because it's the only world that he feels that he can function in. And the only response that he sees to violence is to carry it out on others. People that have caused the same kind of violence that he's seen in himself, he will remove very forcibly from the world. And again, what pushes this ahead for me is that this is all communicated crystal clearly through the filmmaking. And the audience and its main character, the film's main character, are brought on the same journey and the same mediation of violence through the filmmaking. I talked about this a little bit when we did the 250 podcast, but the kind of denial of catharsis that you get here from everything being off screen or after the fact or at a distance, or
even through the grainy CCTV footage
CCTV
that rotates through in a way that misses the violence, which is of its own. Yeah, which is of its own. Like, that's an intense choreography. It's a choreography of the absence of violence, which is remarkable.
Yeah, and it's all still very gripping.
Yeah,
and very bloody and
unflinching,
horrifying, and unflinching. But that through filmmaking is a lack of catharsis. Yeah. We aren't experiencing that because we shouldn't. Yeah. Because this is wrong at its core. This kind of response to violence as well as an acting out of it, and the character gets it. None of this is going to help him. Yeah. And it's only when Joe he's at his lowest point, literally, and as it's most communicated to him that everything that is part of his life, all of this violence it's all as broken as it's ever been. Yeah. His family home is raided, his mother is killed. Yeah. He commits an act of violence, and he sees this other hitman. Yeah. And that's all there is for him. And he's at his lowest point, and he goes to commit suicide. And when he's sinking, he sees the girl, Nina. I only saw it once. And for the very first time, it's looking at somebody else. And that's the first person that you hear but don't see. And he makes a decision at that point to do all of these things in service of something else, because he can't get it for himself, what he's looking for. So he goes to spoilers. Yeah. He goes to save Nina. Yeah. But there's still, that catharsis is still denied. Yeah. Because again, spoilers.
She's already killed the guy.
And what it does from there is that it has this very hopeful note, because she's not broken by this experience, and she can go forward. And if she can do it, and because he's doing these things for another person, perhaps he can do it as well. And it has, again, I talked about strong endings with all the films on my list. You have that moment
in the diner.
And again, this is great filmmaking, great editing, and great writing. He finds Nia in a kitchen in this deep dungeon, insular home, and goes from there with her at her suggestion to a very public, much brighter, much more open
family dining
place of dining. And she leaves, and he has that fantasy. Yeah. And again, it doesn't suggest that this is all magically cured. He still has these feelings. He could still fall back into the same pattern, as we all can. But she comes back. he is really there, you know, to be blunt about it.
Yeah.
He feels that way throughout the film, and yet there is that presence.
Yeah.
You are grounded. What do you do when you have a panic attack or a feeling of anxiety or a feeling of hopelessness? You try and ground yourself and return to where you really are. And she does that, and then he's back. And she says, it's a beautiful day. And Priscilla Page, the critic, wrote about this. That can be a clunker of a line. It's a beautiful day. But he says back, it is a beautiful day, as if he's never even considered that
possibility
ever before. And to have such a bleak film get to this point and earn it, that for me is what pushed it up to number one.
I think I'm with you 100% when you say that all of this is expressed constantly through the filmmaking.
Yeah.
And Lynn Ramsey has such an incredible understanding of the craft of filmmaking. The sound design here is extraordinary. Throughout, just the external...
Sorry, is that a flashback to the Q&A?
I have a question. It's really more of a statement.
Those people. The externalization of trauma in all her films, but I think it comes to a sort of climax here. Everything she's worked on has sort of led up to this, which is, I think for me, probably her best film.
It's actually worst film for me, but that's not to suggest this isn't great.
It's
That's
currently
more to
his
the
fourth favorite film of the year.
But I think all her other films are better, but that's only because the bar is incredibly high.
It is at this point extraordinarily high. And the way there's a scene I often think back on from Morven Caller, where she's lying awake at night, having been sort of unable to grieve in any way, and light from outside causes a shadow from a raindrop running down the window to sort of cast a tear across her face. Ramsey is very good at this sort of thing that is suggesting emotion without ever allowing the characters to feel the emotion of catharsis, as you say often.
It's not just about the characters, though. As Luke pointed out, it's very much about the audience as well. One of the interesting things for me about it is that denial of catharsis, but the questioning and challenging of the audience about why they want it. There's a moment when Joe goes to meet, I think it's Senator Vito possibly, but he goes to meet the father of this girl who's been taken, and they have a conversation. It's a very posh club. And the last thing that the senator says to him is, so this guy I got you through, he tells me you can hurt them. And he's like, that does happen. He's like, I want you to hurt them. And there's very much the film then, through consciously denying it, that violence through editing, through arriving at the scene after the violence, through cutting through the grainy CCTV footage around the violence when he raids the house, forces the audience to evaluate why they want that violence in the film. Like, you notice its absence in a way that's artful and creative and beautiful filmmaking of itself. In that it, like, the great thing about Lynn Ramsey's filmmaking is the fact that, like, she's able to create an absence of which you are aware. She's not just able to depict something, she's able to depict something in a way that emphasizes the absence of something that you expected. And through that sort of challenges you to ask why this story, why you as an audience want this particular story, which is a bold and provocative statement. And I think went over the heads of, like we mentioned, that Q&A. So yeah, it's just wonderful filmmaking from Ramsey. It's just a staggeringly confident piece of work, a very provocative piece, and I think again it has something to say not just about the characters and stuff that Luke alluded to, the arc that Joe goes through, but also about audiences and the stories that we tell and the way that we tell them as well. Particularly in the context of these sorts of films. This could very easily be a Liam Neeson film, where a child has been taken. In fact, the premise suggests a Liam Neeson film, where children have been taken, and there's only one man who's hard enough to hunt them down. And it becomes something so much more elegant and sophisticated and thoughtful.
Yeah, and that's why what it does with, you know, how he fundamentally isn't getting anything out of this works, because in Taken, Liam Neeson's not trying to save his daughter. He's trying to save his own sense of masculinity.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are three of them, so it obviously didn't work.
My favorite one is the third one, where it takes 50 cuts for him to get over a fence. But anyway, so we'll move on to number one for you, Ronan.
It's interesting sort of talking about Lynn Ramsey and her hellish soundscapes, the way she creates this idea of a sort of hell that you proceed through. That's done a lot for me for sound design. I think the film that visually did that for me this year was Dogman, also on Jay's list.
Yeah, number 3 for me.
I didn't know this was coming out. You told me this was coming up on one of our podcasts, and I went to see it that weekend and sort of staggered out of the cinema. Like, oh God, what did I just see? It is bleak as all heck, as a lot of our list has been. And
it's been a bleak sort of year.
It has. And I think, actually, the idea of the bleakness of the world around us informs Dogman in a lot of ways. It gets into a lot of the forgotten places around the world that the deep anger that's taken hold is born, and the way that's born even the meekest people, the circumstances that they've gone through that make them react in strange, dangerous ways. It's centered on an incredible performance. I forgot his name. Marcello Fonte, who won Best Actor at the European Film Awards. And Best Actor Cannes European Film Awards, I think, last week.
Yeah.
His face, he is an extremely passive protagonist, and it's very difficult to build such a compelling film around a protagonist like this, because nobody else gets much of a look in comparison when it comes to screen time, other than dogs, which, great.
Some amazing looking dogs.
There are some incredible dogs in this film, but very rarely too cute, unfortunately. Although there's a lovely one that thaws, that like literally thaws.
Oh my God, that scene.
That scene's extraordinary. It's so strangely funny, this film. In the weirdest ways, it finds humour in very, very dark places, very cold places often.
Scenes sort of play out in strange directions that you kind of think, I would never have thought to let this go this way.
And Matteo Garrone, the writer-director, is most famous probably for Gomorrah, which I still haven't seen, but it came to my attention for Reality back in 2012, which is this extraordinary, strange film. Filmed with this criminal who was sentenced to life imprisonment at the time. About the idea of reality TV and the way it distorts our sense of reality, and I think Dogman circles back to that in a lot of ways. Wherever it's shot, it's this completely forgotten seaside town.
I think it's just outside Naples somewhere.
It just creates this extraordinary sense, the greys, the colour palette of the film.
Nicotine-stained browns everywhere, in puddles and walls. It's
like the film stock itself has just been slathered in mud. It's that kind of aesthetic, and it really brings you down into the grimy sensibility. And it is, again, like You Were Never Really Here, this pretty threadbare crime plot that you will have seen many times before, but elevated by this deep, dense, subtle character study.
It's so low-key and all the better for it. It's like nothing really happens for huge chunks of it as such, except some unbelievable character work that adds so much to it. When things do happen, and it's like, yeah, okay, I can see that. I can see exactly what they're going for here.
There are those rare few films that are so perfectly paced and structured that as they're coming up to the end, you know that you're looking at the last shot, and that any second now it's going to cut to black and absolutely land this. And I had that with this. I was literally like looking at the screen, counting down, going, here it comes. That's it. Lock. Film of the year.
It's such a masterclass in show don't tell cinema, which I really love, and done perfectly. And here it's done pretty perfectly. And the framing, my God, the framing in this film, everything is just as it should be. It's like, building blocks of kind of almost perfect cinema, like just one after another going, right, okay, this guy knows exactly where he's doing here. I absolutely adore it. You
really go on a full character study journey here, in the way that people always talk about Breaking Bad, being this extraordinary slow burn change of a character from one person to the complete opposite. You get that in Dogman in about 2 hours. It's incredible work, and that performance is... it's actually picked by Sarah Green and Rosie for me as well.
Yeah, but they're the two best. If I was doing best actor, best actress, they'd be my winners.
Absolutely.
No better.
Dogman is great.
Cool. And so Niall's number one, as we already discussed, was You Were Never Really Here.
Yeah.
My own one is Annihilation, which I think Luke mentioned earlier in the podcast, which is just a staggering film. It's a wonderful study. First of all, it's a great character study in terms of this idea of life as a constant process of annihilation, destruction, and reconstruction. The idea that we are constantly works in progress, that we demolish our past selves, that we destroy our past selves in order to create new identities and new purposes and to move forward in that. This idea of trauma and suffering suffering, and the idea that like life is basically moving through that and trying to move past that. But also even beyond that, this idea that Alex Garland is doing something interesting with the form and with modern filmmaking. In terms of a lot of the films I've talked about in the top 10, I've argued are, you know, sort of convincing in a case of like encapsulating the year as a whole in media. This is a film that is in many ways about repurposing, recombining, and reinventing. The central thesis of the movie is that it's not destroying, it's creating something new. And Garland is doing that in terms of taking the template of these familiar movies, everything from Alien to Event Horizon, through to 2001: A Space Odyssey at the climax, mashing them all together and fashioning something out of these familiar elements that becomes something new and interesting in a way that reflects how modern pop culture is defined and shaped in those terms. We talked a little bit about Into the Spider-Verse, taking the idea of Spider-Man as a concept that applies across popular culture and using our understanding of that to tell a story that is different and new and reflects like the way in which people process information and narrative in this era. Annihilation does something similar, where it's a movie that takes all these elements that are very familiar, that you can sort of go through, you can recognize the elements of other films in it, but then uses them to tell something that feels different, that feels interesting and compelling and weirdly personal in a way. It's a fascinating study of what it feels like to move through a world where you feel like you don't recognize what's happening around you or what's happening within you. You don't understand yourself or the world around you and how to make sense of that. And the question of, like, from this destruction and this idea that everybody is inherently self-destructive, every cell is inherently self-destructive, but every consciousness, every person engages in these acts of self-destruction and demolition. The idea that what differentiates something truly self-destructive from just living is the idea that we construct something new from that, that we build from that and we push onwards. And it's absolutely staggeringly beautiful in that. Plus, it means that I have 2 films in my top 10 that involve awkward moments where characters have profound realizations while staring at CGI deers. Unfortunately, I couldn't get The Ballad of Buster Scruggs into my top 10, despite my best efforts to make it sort of a nice triptych, thematically speaking.
Would have been lovely.
It would have been, alas.
Could have got Good Favour in there too.
Ah, damn it, there's a whole network there. I think, was that an actual deer or was that computer generated?
Oh, it was computer generated, I'm pretty sure.
All right, do we want to talk down the top 10 consensus picks very, very quickly?
Go on, hit me with it.
What
All right.
have we got?
So what do we think the Scannain, the 10th best sort of consensus pick among the 5 of us here with Niall's input? At number 10, we have a tie between BlacKkKlansman and Mission Impossible Fallout.
Ah.
At number 9, we have Phantom Thread. At number 8, we have Rosie.
Ooh, very nice.
Which is a good showing. It's one of several Irish films on the list here, which is very, very impressive. At number 6, we have a tie. We have a tie between Faces Places
Yay!
and Annihilation.
Excellent.
At number 5, we have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, just one place lower than where it combined on the 2 lists where it's mentioned. At number 4, we have The Image You Missed.
Excellent.
At number 3, we have Dogman.
Well, hey!
At number 2, we have Lady Bird. And at number 1, surprising absolutely nobody, appearing on all 6 lists, including 2 pole positions, it is You Are Never Really Here. So that is...
I have no problem with that list. That's a very worthy
That's-
list.
Winner.
Yeah, I have no
Something
argument.
we can all agree on.
Yeah, it
My
is a
God, what is it all coming to?
consensus, ladies and gentlemen, consensus. But anyway, so we are going to take a break next week.
I'm
because
taking a year off to go to
just
rest.
to unwind after all this. But we will be back in January. Just before we go, a very quick thank you to all of our panelists. So first of all, everybody who's here in the room, thank you very much for doing it this year. We relaunched the Scannain podcast. I wanted to bring back a panel of like experts and people whose opinion in film we really
all you could
respect.
find was
But we couldn't get them, so here we are.
So here's a B panel.
But seriously, yeah, when I suggested to Niall about bringing the Scannain podcast back, a large part of it was in drawing together a very talented group of people from Irish film criticism to talk about film week in and week out, and I think we're very lucky to have that. Obviously, the people who are here tonight, I'm talking about Luke, Grace, Jay, Ronan, but even the people who aren't here tonight, even the people who are absent, who've sort of contributed over the course of the year. Think of Nicola Timmins, Daniel Anderson, Stacey Growden, Alex Towers, Philip Bagnall, Emma Fagan, Dr. Jennifer O'Mara, Andrew Quinn, Graham Day, and of course Donna Kofi as well, who did some great work with the sound design. If this podcast sounds better, it is in large part because of the advice and the equipment that Donica has loaned us. We are very, very thankful for that. And, of course, none of this would be possible without Niall Murphy, who is our editor-in-chief, who isn't actually able to make it tonight.
In memoriam.
I know, this is our in memoriam lead, but thank you very much for taking your time. I'm relatively happy with how this is going this year. In terms of other stuff, so if people are looking for a bit more Luke, a bit more Grace, a bit more Jay, a bit more Ronan in their lives to tide them over the new year, where can they find you guys?
I am Mr. Cynical, that's Cynical with an I, on Twitter, and I'm on filmanddublin.ie. I promise that we'll be more busy in 2019. I promise.
Grace.
I'm at Pixie Grace on Letterboxd and also on Twitter, which I might revive for a while, but you will have to request to follow me because I'm that snobby.
At J. Coyle on Twitter, usual.
Catch me knocking about Twitter at Darren Ronan.
You can follow me at Darren_Mooney, because apparently I can't write nearly enough. I'll be running daily blog posts on the top 10 that you've already heard here. From Thursday, when you listen to this. Also, I co-host another podcast called the 250, where this week to celebrate Christmas, we'll be discussing that great Christmas classic, the feel-good film of the season, LA Confidential, with the wonderful Phil Bagnall. And because we're not off next week, the following week we'll be celebrating New Year by watching Beauty and the Beast. Yes, it's a tale as old as time. Take it easy, guys. Thank you very much for listening. Have a happy Christmas, or a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Take it easy. Bye.
Bye.
Later.